Hey there, you're about to watch a compilation of the most epic battles in history, animated by us. If you want to watch our newest videos right when they come out, be sure to subscribe to our main channel, Series History. Alright, enjoy! Today, we're going over the greatest rivalry in human history. It's the latter half of the 12th century, and in the fragmented chaos of the Middle East, the Crusaders living in the Holy Land have entered into an uneasy truce with the Muslim rulers in the area. Things are tense for the Christians in this strange world, but thanks to the ceasefire, they're able to live in relative peace while planning their next movements. But everything changes in 1187 when a rogue crusader prince named Renaud breaks the truce and begins attacking Muslim caravans. This act of unprovoked aggression simply cannot go unpunished, and the Ayyubid Sultan, a man named Saladin, sets a trap for the Crusaders and he lures them into the Battle of Hattin, where he delivers the most crushing defeat the Christians will ever experience in the Middle East. At Hattin, Saladin executes Renaud himself and captures one of the most holy relics in all of Christianity, a fragment of the true cross, the very cross Jesus was crucified on as his prize. Weeks later, he goes on to recapture Jerusalem, and he begins planning to permanently remove all Christians from the land. Back in Europe, the Pope issues a call for a third crusade to reclaim the Holy City, and kings from the greatest Christian empires begin to take up the cross. Around this time, a young prince named Richard I betrays his father and becomes the King of England. With his throne secured, he joins the crusade and sets his sights on his next glorious conquest, the reclaiming of the true cross and the city of Jerusalem from the Muslims. And so in 1191, Richard and his army set sail for the Middle East. He has no idea that soon he'll be locked in a deadly life-or-death showdown against the most formidable foe he has ever faced. The stage is set for the greatest rivalry in the history of mankind, a legendary warrior king versus a genius tactical strategist. This is the story of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. In 1189, following the fall of Jerusalem, Crusaders in the Holy Land began a siege on the Muslim port city of Acre. The fighting is fierce, with both the Christians and Muslims fully understanding the importance of the city, and momentum swings back and forth daily. Eventually, the Muslim defenders are cut off from their supply lines, and they offer to surrender peacefully, but the Crusaders, hoping for a glorious victory, deny their requests. But the tides of war shift when Saladin arrives with his army. He quickly surrounds the once confident Crusaders, and now they're forced to deal with constant attacks from the city walls in front of them and horse archers sent in by Saladin in their rear. This stagnant double siege situation drags on for a year, and the Crusaders outside the city and the Muslim defenders inside the city begin to starve. The winter of 1190 is brutal, and many of the Christians begin to die from sickness and starvation. It seems the campaign at Acre is headed for failure, and they pray to God to save them. And their prayers are answered in the spring of 1191 when King Philip of France arrives, quickly followed by his frenemy, the newly crowned King Richard of England. Sensing victory is near, the Crusaders celebrate the arrival of the kings, until they see that they're both super sick from their journey and can't fight just yet. While rolling around sick in bed, King Richard sends his first message to Saladin. Dear Saladin, I, Richard I, King of England, and soon all of France as well, request your presence to discuss your surrender of Acre and our holy city of Jerusalem. Oh, and also, can you, send some fruit, please, because I'm feeling quite ill. Thanks! What the fuck? Saladin sends the fruit, but he rejects the meeting, insulted that some kid who's half his age is treating him like an equal. A month goes by, and Philip finally recovers, and he begins his assault on the city in early July. His siege engines pepper Acre's walls, and the defenders signal to Saladin that they may not last much longer. Saladin responds by ordering his men to increase their attacks on the Crusaders, but Philip's presence at Acre seems to have been just what the Crusaders needed to finally take the city. And it's at this point in the story where we really begin to see just what kind of person Richard was. See, he's still super sick, but he can't stand the thought of Philip getting all the glory, so he sets up his own massive catapults, which were named, and I quote, God's own catapult and the bad neighbor, and he begins firing at the city to steal some of Philip's thunder. Richard then orders his men to carry him out on a stretcher near the front lines, and he begins shooting at the defenders with a crossbow while lying down, still looking half dead. The combined Crusader forces break through the city walls, and the defenders desperately plead for Saladin's help. The Muslims in Acre mount one final defense on July 11th, but by the next day, the city was captured and the Christians take the defenders hostage. Richard sets the terms for the surrender. He wants Saladin to return the true cross, along with 200,000 gold pieces and 1,600 previously captured Christian prisoners. In exchange, they'll return their 2,700 captured defenders from Acre. Richard gives Saladin a deadline and waits. King Philip and some other lords, having checked "go crusading" off their bucket list, return to Europe, leaving Richard to collect the spoils. But negotiations soon break down as both sides begin to demand their hostages be returned first, and Saladin ends up missing the deadline. This infuriates Richard, and he aims to send a message to the Sultan of the consequences of messing with the wrong dick. He has his men gather up the 2,700 Muslim prisoners and he marches them up a hill called Ayadiyah. He orders his men to bound the prisoners and then begins beheading them in full view of Saladin's camp. Upon seeing the public execution of their brothers, Saladin's men charge up the hill to save them, but the Crusaders fight them off and force them to watch as they cut off the heads of each prisoner one by one until every single last one is dead. Saladin is enraged and in retaliation orders the immediate execution of his 1,600 Christian prisoners. An eye for an eye, and the rivalry that will make legends of the two men is off to a very disturbing start. With Acre secured, Richard begins to march his men towards the ruined city of Jaffa, which is about 80 miles away. His goal is to set up a string of fortresses that can be used to supply his men for their eventual push to Jerusalem. Saladin gets word from his scouts that Richard is traveling along this coastal path, and he begins planning an attack to wipe out Richard and the Crusaders before they reach the city. Now, Richard was arrogant, impulsive, and kind of a dick, but he was no idiot. He knew that extreme heat and lack of water were the key factors that led to the Crusaders' defeat at Hattin. So he has supply ships running the coast, constantly bringing his troops fresh water and supplies from Acre throughout their march. He also chose a path that allowed the sea to protect his flank. But unknown to Richard, Saladin watched the Crusaders from a distance, concealed in the wooded hills, waiting for the perfect time to strike. As Richard marched his men south, Saladin would periodically send his mounted archers out on hit-and-run attacks at vulnerable stretches of the road. The Christians are heavily armed and can defend against the light arrows, but these attacks take out their horses, and this slows them down. As Richard travels along the road, Saladin expertly moves his men in the cover of the woods, pacing with the Crusaders. Richard is oblivious to just how many Muslims are waiting in the shadows to attack him, until the morning of September 7, 1191, when they near the ruined city of Arsuf. Richard is getting his men into formation to continue their trek when war drums and trumpets cut through the still morning air, and thousands of mounted archers screaming their battle cries begin to charge towards the Crusaders. The Christians look up to the wooded hills, and the full might of Saladin's army emerges from the shadows, and soon their numbers black out the horizon. Over 25,000 men. Richard's army is less than half the size at around 12,000. Like waves cresting over the hills, Saladin's archers swarm the Crusaders and launch a heavy barrage of arrows. The Crusaders defend themselves, but more of their horses and pack animals are killed. Richard commands his army to position themselves into a defensive formation and begin returning crossbow fire while continuing to move towards Arsuf. Saladin's army bears down on the Crusaders, and their march slows to a near standstill. Arrows continue to rain down on the Christians, and the Knights Hospitallers in the rear are getting the worst of it.
Richard, come on, bro, let us hold!
The young king carefully watches the movements of the Muslim soldiers, and he's suddenly stricken with terror as he realizes what the Sultan is trying to do.
My God, Saladin's tactics are designed to break our formation. If any part of our line retaliates, it will create a gap, and he will send cavalry into the opening. They will slaughter us from the inside out. The victory at Hattin was not a fluke. If I make a single mistake now, the cost will be the lives of every Christian.
Richard, bro, look, they shot more of our horses. Come on, man, you got less fight back. Hold!
The full force of the Muslim army bears down on the Crusaders, who are now pinned to a standstill and growing frustrated that Richard is holding them back. Sensing victory is at hand, Saladin rides behind his men, shouting words of encouragement over the drums, and the Muslims respond with increased ferocity. The archers begin to dismount and increase their rate of fire, and Richard and his men are completely trapped. Saladin's infantry then begin their march towards the Crusaders to finish them off. Seeing this, the Hospitallers again demand to charge, but Richard again instructs them to hold and wait for the signal.
This is some fucking bull. Yeah! Taste my steel, you dirty Saracen!
Oh, for f***'s sake.
The Knights Hospitaller cannot take it anymore and break formation. They charge directly at the advancing Muslim force. More of the Crusaders follow their lead, and Richard realizes it's now or never. He had held his troops back as long as he could, and finally, he gives the signal for a full counterattack. The Crusaders' trumpets blare 6 times, and in unison, the Knights charge at full speed towards Saladin's men. The Muslims had been attacking the Crusaders for hours unanswered and had slipped into a false sense of security, and they're startled by the faces of the Christians who are now charging directly at them. Like tortured, caged animals who had finally been set free, the Crusaders roar and begin ruthlessly slaughtering Saladin's forces. Richard and his heavy cavalry smash into the archers, and in the blink of an eye, Saladin watches as his victory is snatched from his hands. He and his generals stand in disbelief as his men stream past them, fleeing in terror. Richard is leading the cavalry from the front and engages personally in savage hand-to-hand combat. The Sultan regains his composure and sees that the Crusaders have lost themselves to bloodlust. He quickly comes up with a counter-strategy and orders a full retreat into the woods. If he can lure the Christians into the shadows, he can regroup his men and ambush them. The Muslims race into the cover of the trees with the Crusaders in hot pursuit. But just as they begin to charge blindly into the woods, Richard commands them to stop. The Christians, against all odds, manage to fight back their instincts to continue the chase and stop themselves just short of Saladin's trap. The Sultan watches from the shadows as his strategy is again defeated for the second time today, and he recognizes that King Richard will not be easily defeated like the Christians he had fought in the past. Richard loses around 700 men in the Battle of Arsuf, while Saladin loses around 7,000 in defeat. The Crusaders celebrate their victory and continue on towards Jaffa, unaware that their destination would become the stage for the epic final showdown between the two legendary commanders. Richard and the Crusaders make it to Jaffa and quickly work to repair the fallen city. Saladin's scouts report on the progress made by the Christians, and he realizes that Richard is trying to set up a string of supply stations to Jerusalem. If Richard is able to do this, defending the holy city against a well-fed and well-supplied army of Crusaders will be near impossible. The battle at Arsuf has shown the battlefield abilities of the Christian king, so Saladin changes his strategy from direct combat to sabotage. He's about to show Richard that there are levels to this game of war. Saladin begins by destroying every port city and town en route to Jerusalem, starting with Ascalon, Richard's logical next destination. He knows that this will do 2 things. It'll force Richard to spend more time and resources building their own staging areas, and he's banking that the Crusaders will grow frustrated by the delays. Just as planned, Richard spent months refortifying Ascalon and spent more time fixing the destroyed forts along the road to Jerusalem. As time passed, the Crusaders became increasingly frustrated by the lack of action. They came here to fight, not to work as laborers, and Saladin's plan is playing out exactly as he thought it would. Throughout the entire time Richard was setting up supply lines, Saladin continued his hit-and-run tactics, which sunk Crusader spirits even further, and soon some of the knights began to leave and head back to other Christian cities in the area. Richard finds himself stuck between a rock and a hard place. He knows he needs logistics for any chance of success, but none of the other Crusaders seem to get it. They want to fight. They want to take Jerusalem. So eventually, they force Richard to make 2 attempts to recapture the holy city, once getting within 12 miles of their goal. But both times, he turns them around when he realizes the risks are far too great. Seeing Jerusalem with their own eyes and then having to turn around without even attempting to take it crushes the last bits of morale amongst the Crusaders. Richard pitches a plan to take Egypt to cut off Saladin's supply lines, but they've lost faith in his leadership and refuse. Ironically, the only person who seems to get him is Saladin, and this is where the dynamics between the 2 leaders starts to get very interesting. See, both Richard and Saladin had been sending envoys to each other this whole time, trying to come to some sort of an understanding, and through these interactions, both Richard and Saladin begin to see their enemy in a new light. Saladin would often send his brother Al-Adil as the chief negotiator, and he and Richard actually became really good friends. So much so that Richard even offers up a plan where Al-Adil marries his sister to create peace through marriage. He didn't bother to ask his sister for her input on this arrangement, but hey, I guess it was a nice gesture. Through his friendship with Al-Adil, Richard's feelings towards the Muslims begins to evolve. They're not the monsters people in Europe said they were. Al-Adil is f***ing cool, and his brother Saladin, well, he's a wise and honorable king. But he can't really say this stuff out loud to his men. The rest of the Crusaders don't really feel the same, and they're getting more and more pissed that Richard is still not leading them to retake Jerusalem. Oh, and to make matters even worse, remember his frenemy King Philip of France? Well, Richard gets word that back in Europe, that dickhead is now working on a plan with his own brother Prince John, aka the bad guy in Robin Hood, to steal his throne and his lands while he's away in the Middle East. F***ing fantastic. Ugh. Everything seems to be falling apart for Richard. Despite not losing a single battle against the Muslims, Saladin's strategy had worked perfectly, and he has him on the ropes. Now under immense pressure, Richard needs to wrap this crusade up quick, and he travels to Acre to rally the additional troops he needs. Saladin is notified by his scouts that Richard's away, and he finally sees the opportunity he had been waiting for this whole time. With Richard in Acre, Jaffa was left almost completely undefended, and if he were to capture the city, Richard would be forced to try to take it again. The Crusaders would revolt to this plan, and without an army, the king's time in the Holy Land would be done. A complete victory without even having to fight him on the battlefield. And so Saladin quickly moves his forces to Jaffa to deliver the knockout punch. On the morning of July 27, 1192, the defenders at Jaffa wake up to the sights and sounds of an enormous Muslim army outside their walls. Saladin wastes no time and orders a full-out assault on the city. The Christians quickly send off a messenger to Acre and pray that he'll reach Richard before it's too late. The defenders do their best to hold off Saladin, fighting bravely though massively outnumbered, but the walls are soon breached and the Muslims storm their way into the city within 3 days. Fighting breaks out on the streets and surviving Crusaders are driven back into the citadel. The exhausted messenger sent from Jaffa reaches Acre in record time and delivers the dire news to Richard. He quickly gathers as many men as he can find and they board ships to make a beeline back to Jaffa. He understands the stakes as well as Saladin. If he doesn't make it in time, everything he had worked so hard for over the past year and a half would be for nothing. They arrive at Jaffa on August 1st, but the Crusaders begin to hang their heads in defeat when they see Saladin's flags flying on the city walls. They're too late. But suddenly, in the distance, Richard sees a man frantically swimming towards their ship. They pull him up, and he turns out to be a priest who was in Jaffa at the time of the attack. He tells them that hope is not lost. The Christians still live and are in the citadel waiting for you. They're ready to fight on. And upon hearing this, Richard grabs a crossbow and his sword, jumps off the ship, and begins to wade toward the shore. The knights on board follow his lead, and together they fearlessly advance directly towards the Muslim camp outside the city. Richard reaches shore and he quickly unloads a crossbow bolt into the first Muslim he sees. He then draws his sword and rushes headfirst into Saladin's camp. The Crusaders, swords drawn, follow their king and they engage the shocked Muslims in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Saladin's men cannot believe the boldness of these knights, and Richard leads from the front, hacking and slashing his way towards the city walls. The banner of the Lionheart is carried into battle as more and more Crusaders follow Richard's lead and begin jumping off their ships and wading to shore. Richard and his initial strike force make it into the city and fighting breaks out on every street. The Christians in the citadel, hearing the sounds of combat, are startled from their stupor. They peer out and see the flag of King Richard flying in the wind and are filled with his courage. They pour out of the citadel and join their fellow Crusaders in battle, now unafraid of death itself. Saladin is shocked and cannot believe what he's seeing. For a year, he had meticulously planned this battle. His execution was flawless. Jaffa had fallen, yet now his soldiers are desperately fleeing the city. He orders the rest of his men to retreat and they regroup a few miles away. As night falls, the Crusaders within the city have a brief moment of celebration. Against all odds, Richard has again led them to victory. But the king knows that the battle is not yet won. Saladin had bet everything on Jaffa, and he will strike again. It dawns on both leaders that the next battle will be the final round in their year-and-a-half-long slugfest, and this will take place on August 4th, 1192. After Richard's epic rescue of Jaffa, he quickly has his men prepare defenses for Saladin's eventual counterattack. He dismantles his ships to create barricades and prays that the reinforcements from the north traveling on foot will reach them in time for the final assault. But unknown to Richard, Saladin had expected those reinforcements and had already sent troops to cut them off. Most of the forces Richard was banking on never make it to Jaffa. Saladin knows he cannot delay forever. Eventually, the Crusaders will rally more troops, and by his estimates, his current army still outnumbers the Crusaders at least 2-1. So in the darkness of the early morning on August 4th, 1192, the Sultan moves his entire remaining force to the city. In the early morning sun, a crusader out on morning patrol catches the glint of armor in the distance, and Richard quickly mobilizes his men into a pre-planned defensive formation. They position lances into a menacing hedge to stop cavalry charges, and foot soldiers brace themselves, holding shields to deflect the coming storm of Muslim arrows. Richard then strategically places pairs of crossbowmen behind the shields. Saladin nervously arrives on the battlefield, but as he looks out at Richard's army, a grin creeps across his face. He counts no more than 2,000 men in total. He looks to Richard on his horse and counts less than 10 other mounted knights with him. The army he brought with him numbers around 15,000 soldiers. It seems God has finally chosen the victor for this year-long war. Saladin delays no further. War drums and trumpets signal the final round between Richard and Saladin, and his mounted archers begin racing towards the Crusaders. Richard's men steel themselves for the upcoming battle, and he gives the signal for his crossbowmen to let loose their first round of deadly bolts. Dozens of the Muslim archers are knocked off their horses, and the remaining riders are shocked to be greeted by an immediate second wave of bolts from the Crusaders. Richard had instructed his crossbowmen to fire in volleys. As one group shot, the other reloaded, and through this tactic, the Muslims are forced to deal with a steady stream of unrelenting projectiles every time they try to approach. The Muslims try to bait the Crusaders into a charge by faking a retreat, but after the first battle, Richard has regained the full trust of his men and no one takes the bait. The only things that chase the retreating Muslims are crossbow bolts that find their way into their backs. This goes on for hours, and both sides grow exhausted. The Christians from the constant loading and firing of their crossbows, and the Muslims from the constant dying. Though outnumbering the Crusaders 5-1, Saladin's men begin to wilt, and sensing his chance, Richard leads his small group of mounted knights into a full-blown charge, which is quickly joined by his infantry. After surviving hours of constant crossbow fire, the Muslims are exhausted and have lost their will to fight. They begin to run, and Richard leads the Crusaders in cutting down the Sultan's men as they attempt to flee. But just as victory seems all but secured, Saladin sends a group of his soldiers into the city. The Sultan's men quickly overrun the guards, and Richard is forced to pull a strike force from the battlefield and storm into the city to save the day again. Richard routs the Muslims in the city, and Saladin has lost all words. He had meticulously planned for every scenario, but it was not enough. Had he gone up against any other Christian knight, there would have been no chance of failure. But Richard was undeniably the greatest warrior he has ever witnessed. As the sun sets, the two exhausted armies pull back for the night. The Muslims had lost over 1,500 horses and 700 men, and the Crusaders had lost 2 but suffered many injuries in the battle. Richard had once again defeated Saladin in combat, but after a year and a half of constant fighting, the king's body finally hit its breaking point. At night, he breaks out into a debilitating fever that leaves him bedridden. Priests and other healers in the Crusader camp try their best to cure him, but Richard is so sick it looks like he might die. Saladin's scouts bring him the news, but instead of celebrating the coming death of his greatest enemy, Saladin is concerned.
It's not fair. A man who had proven himself to be invincible in battle is betrayed by his own body? It cannot be.
In some versions of this story, Saladin sends his personal doctor with cooling fruits and ice from the mountain to treat Richard. The Crusaders, desperate for help, allow the doctor to treat the king, and he begins to recover. Though they've spent over a year trying to kill each other, neither the king nor the Sultan can deny the greatness of their enemy any longer. To Richard, Saladin was an honorable ruler, fair to his people and enemies alike. A great king and a worthy rival. And to Saladin, Richard was the bravest warrior he had ever seen. A man without equal on the battlefield, though he probably still didn't really trust him. And so, on September 2nd, 1192, the king and the Sultan signed a truce now known as the Treaty of Jaffa. Under this agreement, Saladin was allowed to retain control of Jerusalem under the condition that Christians be allowed safe passage into the city. The Crusaders will be allowed to keep their coastal cities, and neither side will attack the other for 3 years. The Treaty of Jaffa officially ended the Third Crusade, and Richard leaves for Europe to go deal with his asshole brother and frenemy Philip. Now, what happens to Richard after he leaves the Holy Land could be an entire video all on its own, so we'll save that story for another day. But as for Saladin, exhausted from the fighting that had consumed his life for nearly 3 decades, he passes away less than a year later. But stories of the chivalrous Sultan make their way back to Europe, and nobles throughout the land are fascinated by the tales of his tactical brilliance on the battlefield and the kindness he shows not only to his people, but his enemies as well. A Christian king and a Muslim sultan finding understanding and respect for one another through a series of epic battles in the Middle Ages may sound like some Hollywood BS, but it really happened. And it just goes to show that maybe the real Crusades are the friends we made along the way. Or something like that. It's February 1815, and on a small island just off the coast of Italy, Napoleon is staring longingly at the continent he once ruled in the distance. Just a year ago, he'd controlled more of Europe than any man since the height of the Roman Empire. As the Emperor of France, he'd conquered nearly the entire continent. But now, his empire was reduced to 2 tiny Mediterranean islands, his subjects little more than goats and fishermen. It had taken the combined forces of literally every European nation and a major assist from Mother Nature before Napoleon was finally defeated in the War of the Sixth Coalition. To prevent him from becoming a martyr, the great powers chose to exile Napoleon to the tiny island of Elba to live out the rest of his days. He'd be cut off from his people, and he would be given the ultimate punishment for a man of such ambition. He would be forced to helplessly watch as Europe moved on without him. Upon arriving on Elba, Napoleon had initially resigned himself to his fate and simply planned to improve the island and make it his new home. But soon, he begins to receive letters from supporters that make it sound like Europe's having a lot more trouble moving on than they expected. The great powers of the coalition who defeated him have gathered at the Congress of Vienna and are trying to put Europe back together. But without their common enemy, they've begun to turn on each other and squabble over who gets what after beating Napoleon. Meanwhile, back in France, the coalition had placed a new king, Louis XVIII, on the throne. But he quickly becomes unpopular by reminding everyone why they got rid of their king in the first place. He's out of touch, and the soldiers who are now not being paid begin to look back fondly on the days when Napoleon ruled. Letters pour into Elba, telling Napoleon that if he were to return, the people of France would welcome him with open arms. So, as he watches the sun set, Napoleon quietly decides to once again change the course of history. He orders the repair of his ship, the Inconstant, and in the dark of night on Sunday, February 26, 1815, Napoleon and 1,000 of his most loyal soldiers leave Elba and set sail for the European coast. The Corsican monster, the nightmare that had terrorized Europe for nearly 2 decades, is en route back to France. On March 7th, Metternich, the acting head of the Congress of Vienna, is awakened in the middle of the night with an urgent message from Elba. Upon hearing the report, a chill runs down his spine. Napoleon is missing. Within the hour, he gathers the leaders of Europe together and shares the news, and the Congress of Vienna immediately falls into chaos. Everyone begins to panic and point fingers at each other. The English are blamed for letting him escape, the French for not providing Napoleon's promised allowance, the Russians are considered as potential turncoats. But in the end, it does not matter. The greatest threat to Europe has returned, and all they can do is prepare for war. On March 1st, Napoleon sets foot onto French soil for the first time in 300 days and begins his march to Paris. The king orders the 5th Regiment to find Napoleon and stop him, using lethal force if necessary. They meet just outside of the town of Grenoble, and the 5th stands in formation on the road blocking the emperor's path. Napoleon's guard ready their weapons, and the 2 armies size each other up. The king's soldiers stare down the barrels of their guns, locked on the man who had ruled them all less than a year ago. Napoleon steps forward, holds out his arms and shouts,
Here I am! Kill your emperor, if you wish!
Nobody moves, and the silence is deafening. The men on both sides stand nervously with their weapons at the ready. Finally, after what seems like an eternity, a member of the 5th Regiment lowers his rifle. One by one, the French soldiers follow his lead. Someone in formation shouts out, "Long live the Emperor!" And this call is quickly answered with a resounding reply from every soldier on both sides of the standoff. "Long live the Emperor!" They all shout in unison. The 5th Regiment throws down their weapons and rush to Napoleon with arms raised victoriously in the air. They shake hands with Napoleon's guard, and together they all celebrate his long-awaited return. Napoleon's now larger rebel army continued its march to Paris. Over the next 20 days, 12,000 more soldiers would be sent out by King Louis to capture Napoleon, and they would all immediately defect to join him. As the news spreads throughout Europe, the Congress of Vienna realizes they must put aside their differences and again work together if an independent Europe is to survive. On Monday, March 13th, Napoleon is declared an outlaw by the nations of Austria, Great Britain, Prussia, and Russia. With more and more of the French army defecting to the former emperor, King Louis runs away to Belgium, and on March 20th, just 20 days after his arrival, Napoleon marches into Paris unopposed. The city erupts into celebration. He retakes the throne without firing a single bullet. The emperor has returned.
Oh my God! The Emperor has returned!
On March 25th, the Congress of Vienna ratified the Treaty of Alliance against Napoleon. Each of the four great powers promised 150,000 men for the fight. No more half measures. Napoleon must be defeated decisively once and for all, and they begin to draw up plans for a July 1st invasion of France. Two European armies are quickly assembled in Belgium near the French border to defend against a possible invasion. A British army is led by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, who commands a ragtag group of 92,000 Dutch, English, and German troops, and a Prussian army that's led by Marshal von Blücher with around 121,000 Prussian soldiers. Both commanders are hardened veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. They know their enemy, and they're trusted with the unenviable task of holding off the emperor as long as possible to give the rest of the coalition time to rally their armies. Back in France, Napoleon's quickly put together a new French army of 124,000 troops. He hears of the planned Allied invasion and of the two armies already stationed in Belgium. He realizes he must quickly make a choice. He can continue to rebuild his army and defend against the coming invasion, or he can go on the offense and knock out the English and Prussian armies now. If he destroys both armies, there's a chance he can force the coalition into a peace treaty where he remains the ruler of France. And so he chooses to go on the offense and strike now. Napoleon knows a combined British and Prussian army would outnumber his men 2-1, but he has a plan. The two Allied armies are still separated. If he moves quickly, he can drive his army in between them, cut them off from each other, and take them out one at a time. But this plan means he must move immediately. If he delays any further, Wellington and Blücher will coordinate and fortify their positions together. So Napoleon takes his army and boldly crosses the border into Belgium on June 15th. The Prussians are the first to encounter Napoleon's men and are shocked at his speed of movement. They try to hold them back, but they are unprepared and ultimately fail. The British are warned, and the Duke of Wellington and Blücher quickly begin their preparations for their inevitable date with the Demon of France. They both know from experience that Napoleon will not give them time to prepare. Within 24 hours, they'll be forced once again into battle against the greatest general of their lifetime. The next day, Napoleon makes his move. He divides his men and places half his army under the command of the man he had called the bravest of the brave, Field Marshal Michel Ney, and gives him orders to capture the British-held town of Quatre Bras. At the same time, he personally takes the remainder of his men and marches toward the small village of Ligny to engage the Prussians. With lightning speed, Napoleon moves his men into position and waits. At 2:30 p.m., he finally hears cannon fire coming from Quatre Bras. Ney has begun his assault, so in turn, he gives the command to attack. French cannons open fire on the Prussians, and his troops rush into battle. Fighting engulfs the streets of Ligny. Homes and buildings are quickly stormed and used as defensive positions. The townspeople trapped in the crossfire can do nothing but cover their eyes and ears and hold their children close as carnage erupts all around them. The Prussians fight bitterly, but Napoleon's army is like an unstoppable force of nature. By the end of the day, 16,000 Prussian soldiers are dead, and those still alive are forced to retreat. Blücher is nearly killed in the battle after his horse is shot out from under him, but he somehow survives. And can I just stop here for just a second and point out that Blücher was 72 years old at this battle? He's literally a grandpa out there leading cavalry charges against the world's greatest general. What a Chad! Anyway, Blücher's generals push for a full retreat, but he refuses. He must remain close to help the Duke of Wellington when the time comes. This he had promised. So instead, he regroups his army to the north just 18 miles away. He'll risk the lives of all of his men to keep his word. At Quatre Bras, Ney has less luck against the British. He had hesitated, and this delay had allowed his enemy time to fully fortify their positions. He has more men, but they're now running straight into heavy defensive fire, and wave after wave of his soldiers die trying to take the town. As the sun sets, the Duke of Wellington's forces have successfully stopped Ney's advance. In the cover of night, the British safely retreat to Waterloo, while a disgruntled Marshal Ney slinks back to Napoleon. Now, Ney had failed to crush the British forces at Quatre Bras, but he did manage to keep them separated from the Prussians. Phase 1 of Napoleon's plan had still worked, and they can now use the full power of the French army to crush each of their enemies one at a time. But Napoleon receives a report that some of the Prussians are still nearby. If they reach the British and combine their forces, the battle will become much more difficult. He cannot allow this to happen. So he draws up plans to attack Wellington immediately. He will crush the British army before Blucher and the Prussians have any hope of saving them. The fate of Europe will come down to a race against time. And this final decisive battle will happen on Sunday, June 18, 1815, at a place called Waterloo. Following Quatre Bras, the Duke of Wellington and his men scrambled to fortify defensive positions near a ridge in an area just south of a tiny village called Waterloo. His army is a ragtag group of inexperienced Germans, Dutch, and Belgian soldiers who have joined his elite British troops. In response to the news of Napoleon's return, they were assembled at the last minute by the coalition. It was the best they could do with such limited time, and this army of green recruits is all Wellington has to work with to try to stop the world's greatest general and his army of seasoned veterans. They turned 3 farmhouses into makeshift forts. Hougoumont to the right, La Haye Sainte to the center, and Papillote to the left. Each one is filled with elite British troops. Blucher sends word to Wellington that they're coming to join him in battle, but they are still hours away. The British will be on their own until their arrival, but if they can hold on, they can win. After Ligny, Napoleon assumes the main Prussian force has been neutralized, buying him more than enough time to finish off Wellington and his men. But just as a precaution, he sends out a third of his army to find the remaining Prussian units and wipe them out before they can join up with Wellington. The night of June 17th is an uneasy one for everyone. As if mourning the death and destruction to come, the skies open up and a thunderstorm soaks the ground overnight. The sky is clear by morning, but much of the land between Napoleon's position and the British fortifications has been turned into a thick sea of mud. Napoleon, who wanted to attack at 9 a.m., now waits hours for the sun to dry the ground before he begins his advance towards the British position. No matter, he's still confident that the Prussians are broken and his men will wipe the inexperienced British out in no time. Upon their arrival at the battlefield, the French soldiers disperse into their proper formations, and finally, at 11 a.m., Napoleon gives the signal. His men launch their first attack to the right on Hougoumont. Cannon fire breaks the silence of the midday as French troops storm the farmhouse. The plan is to force Wellington's hand and make him take troops from his center formation to reinforce his right. But the Allied troops at Hougoumont fight back with everything they got, and Napoleon's men begin to take heavy losses as they approach the farmhouse. Wellington calmly observes from a distance, and he does not commit any further reinforcements from his center. Napoleon's first move has been countered, so he answers with increased violence. At noon, Napoleon sends a volley of cannon fire at the English center and sends his troops to take La Haye Sainte. The Allied forces grip their bayonets and watch as the French column of death slowly marches towards them, their steps shaking the ground as they scream, "Vive l'Empereur! Long live the Emperor!" Napoleon's forces charge the position and the fighting quickly devolves into violence at a horrific scale. Bayonets and fists become the weapons of last resort as the defenders close ranks. The British are pushed back further and further until Wellington finally counterpunches by sending his elite cavalry into the fray. They smash into the French infantry and they begin to scatter. Filled with confidence, the horse riders follow in hot pursuit, easily cutting down French soldiers as they retreat. But in their excitement, the British cavalry overextend themselves and ride into range of Napoleon's cannons. A brutal cannon barrage rips horses and riders apart. Napoleon signals for his elite lancers to charge, and they make quick work of the now stranded British cavalry. Without the cavalry support, the English infantry are now undefended on their flanks, and they're slowly succumbing to Napoleon's forces. The Emperor smiles grimly, sensing that victory is near. He's contemplating his next attack, when out of the corner of his eye, he spots something in the distance. He grabs his spyglass to investigate and cannot believe what he sees. The army he had sent out to slow the Prussians has failed, and they're now charging towards the battlefield. He's now on the clock, and he must wipe out the British before the Prussians arrive. Napoleon lowers the spyglass and clutches his stomach in pain. He'd been suffering throughout the battle with some sort of infection, and the pain had increased to an intolerable level despite the laudanum he'd been taking. He decides to take a break and rest up for the final confrontation and places his trusted marshal, Michel Ney, in charge while he lies down. Upon assuming command, Ney sees what he believes to be weakened British infantry formations pulling back over the ridge. They're running! He can crush them now if he acts quickly. So, without consulting Napoleon, he personally leads a massive cavalry charge up the hill towards the retreating British infantry on the ridge. Wellington sees 9,000 elite French cavalry storming directly towards his position and is forced to think fast. He turns and orders the infantry on the ridge to form up into hollow square formations, with every man pointing his weapon outward. The British soldiers frantically race into position as the thunderous roar of the stampeding French cavalry grows louder and louder. The ground beneath the British begins to shake as Ney's cavalry finally crest the hill, and upon sight, the Allied formations open fire. The French riders try to smash into the British formations, but their horses defy the orders and refuse to charge into the hedge of bayonet blades. They instead race around the squares like water flowing around rocks in a stream. The French soldiers are picked apart by the British, who are now firing at them from every direction. Ney continues to send waves of cavalry over the hill, and every wave of cavalry meets the same gruesome fate. Eventually, the French riders are forced to pull back, having won nothing and suffering massive casualties. The Prussians continue racing towards the battlefield, and Napoleon now realizes he has just an hour or two at most before all hope of victory is lost. He urges his men to fight on, but the unfamiliar feeling of desperation begins to crack his invincible will. Finally, the French take the farmhouse of Les Saintes, and Napoleon quickly pushes his cannons forward. From this position, he fires on the British at close range, punching a hole right through the Allied center. Though Wellington's army had exceeded all expectations, Napoleon was still Napoleon. He's the greatest general of their time, and the Allied defense is now on the brink of collapse. As his men continue to fall, Wellington looks west to the setting sun. If he can just hold out a little longer, they may be saved by nightfall. But suddenly, he hears soldiers to his left erupt into cheers. His head snaps in their direction, and he sees Blücher has made good on his word. Though they're late, the Prussians have arrived at Waterloo. Blücher's army smashes into Napoleon's eastern flank, and the French emperor is forced to divert troops to defend his position. Now surrounded on three sides, he's fighting purely for survival. And it's at this point Napoleon plays his final move, his trump card that he's kept close to the vest only to be used in the direst of circumstances. He gives the order for his Imperial Guard to attack. Made up of entirely elite veterans, this unit was the crown jewel of Napoleon's army. Just their name alone would strike fear into the hearts of the enemies of France, and they were now marching directly towards the British position. The Allied troops fire into the Imperial Guard, trying to stop them, but undaunted, they continue their march up the hill towards Wellington's men. Ready for the bloody fight to come, the first of Napoleon's elite soldiers crest the hill, but they're surprised to find not one British soldier there. It's eerily quiet, and as the rest of the guard join them on the hill, they are equally confused. As they survey the land, searching for the enemy, a cry breaks the silence.
Now, Maitland! Now's your time!
Wellington shouts. On command, Sir Peregrine Maitland and his 1,500 troops, who had hidden themselves in the tall grass, stand and begin opening fire on the startled French soldiers. The British had positioned themselves in a long, thin line to ensure every soldier had a clear shot. And at this close of a range, they didn't miss. It's a literal firing squad, and the Imperial Guard is ripped apart. The remains of the shocked guard attempt to fight back, but they're quickly met by a bayonet charge, and it's at this moment that the most legendary unit of Napoleon's Grand Army does something they had never done before. They turn and begin to run. The sight of the Imperial Guard running for their lives breaks the will of Napoleon's men. If the best troops think this battle is lost, it most certainly is. Panic sweeps through the entire French army and they all begin to flee. Wellington orders a counterattack, and British, Belgian, German, and Dutch troops stream down the hill towards Napoleon's position. The Prussians push in from the east, and Napoleon realizes the day is lost. He retreats. At 9 p.m., Wellington and Blücher embrace on the battlefield, having pulled off the impossible. Together, they've vanquished the nightmare that has plagued Europe for nearly 2 decades. Napoleon returns to Paris, hoping to raise another army, but the loss at Waterloo had turned his people against him. His second reign as Emperor of France is done. It had lasted just 100 days. He's forced to abdicate the throne for a second time and is once again exiled, this time to the remote island of St. Helena. Here, on a tiny island off the coast of Africa, Napoleon lives out the rest of his life, fiercely guarded to ensure he will never escape to terrorize Europe again. Thanks to the heroics of the Duke of Wellington and Blucher, Europe enjoys a relative peace that lasts for nearly 100 years. This peace brings about the Industrial Revolution, and technological breakthroughs would transform the world into one that's completely unrecognizable to Napoleon and his opponents at Waterloo. Thanks to its rich deposits of iron and coal, Prussia would quickly become one of the most powerful nations in Europe and eventually evolve into the mighty German Empire. And at the dawn of the 20th century, this empire would field the most terrifying army the world had ever seen. It would soon be their turn to fight against a coalition of nations in a war so catastrophic, it would eventually engulf the entire world.
Ain Jalut. It's 1231, and the once vast and powerful empire known as Khwarezmia lies in complete ruin. As retribution for the disrespect shown to Mongol emissaries by the governor of Otrar, Genghis Khan and his army had invaded the land, killing an estimated 15 million people as they burned entire cities to the ground. Amongst the remnants of the once proud civilization, the Mongols who continued their occupation of the land find a young Khwarezmian prince and sell him to a slave merchant in Egypt. The boy is purchased by the local sultan and is put into training to become a Mamluk, a warrior class of slaves used by the rulers of the Muslim world as elite knights. The former prince is thrown in with the rest of the slave children and is forced to endure the strictest of training regiments designed to turn boys into hardened men. From a young age, he is thrust into combat against other children, and he is given the name Kutus, the rabid dog, because he fights like a vicious beast against the other slaves. Kutus rises through the ranks and eventually becomes the vice sultan of Egypt in 1253. By now, the Mamluks had revolted against their masters and established their own sultanate, becoming the rulers of the land. Against all odds, the former prince had made his way from slavery back to a royal position. But an easy life was not his destiny, and ghosts from his past would soon return to haunt him. Though Genghis Khan had died in 1227, his grandson Hulagu Khan had continued the Mongol expansion westward. Like demons, they had brought nothing but death and destruction to every land they touched. In 1254, they sacked the city of Baghdad and massacred all of its inhabitants, ending the Islamic Golden Age. The Mongols then pushed into Syria and took the cities of Aleppo and Damascus. The Ayyubid Sultan sends word to Egypt, pleading for help against the Mongols, and Kutus is haunted by the memories of the destruction of his homeland. He knows the horrors the horde from the east will bring, and if the Mamluks are to have any chance of survival, Egypt must have strong leadership. He deposes the young and inexperienced Sultan and takes the throne for himself. As if on cue, Hulagu Khan's diplomats soon arrive in Cairo, and they begin to read a very Mongol-sounding message to the new Sultan. From the King of Kings of the East and West, the Great Khan, to Kutus the Mamluk, who fled to escape our swords. You should think of what happened to other countries and submit to us. You have heard how we have conquered a vast empire and have purified the earth of the disorders that tainted it. We have conquered vast areas, massacring all the people. You cannot escape from the terror of our armies. Where can you flee? What road will you use to escape us? Our horses are swift, our arrows sharp, our swords like thunderbolts, our hearts as hard as the mountains, our soldiers as numerous as the sand. Fortresses will not detain us, nor armies stop us. Your prayers to God will not avail against us. We are not moved by tears nor touched by lamentations. Only those who beg for our protection will be safe. Hasten your reply before the fire of war is kindled. Resist, and you will suffer the most terrible catastrophes. We will shatter your mosques and reveal the weakness of your God, and then we will kill your children and your old men together. At present, you are the only enemy against whom we have to march. As the messenger speaks his final words, the Mamluk advisors are literally shaking in fear. Kutus looks to his officials and his blood begins to boil. He calls for counsel away from the Mongol diplomats, and in private, the Sultan begins an impassioned plea to the council. You all have lived good lives funded by the taxes of the people, and now you wish to abandon them? Kutus continues to argue with those who wish to flee, and his voice begins to quiver with desperation. Finally, he looks to his advisors as tears begin to stream down his cheeks. My brothers, who will defend Islam if not us? The Mongols had taken everything from him as a child. He could not let them do it again. The generals and nobles are moved by his words, and despite knowing they would most likely be accepting their own deaths with the decision, they agree to follow him into battle. With that, Qutuz and his men solemnly return to the Mongol messengers. The Sultan looks towards his guests and calmly gives a signal. His soldiers step forward and slice the diplomats in half. Their heads are removed and hung from the south gates of Cairo as an open act of defiance. A letter is sent to Hulagu notifying the Mongols that the Mamluks will not bow down and will instead fight to the end. Qutuz is soon joined by a rival Mamluk general named Baybars, a man who was also sold into slavery as a child by the Mongols, and they quickly begin to raise an army and set out to confront the enemy from the east. The Mamluks cobble together 24,000 men, but they are vastly outnumbered by the Mongols, nearly 3 to 1. It looks like this will be another trademark Mongol Muslim massacre, but fate intervenes when the great Khan Mongke dies. Hulagu is forced to return to his homeland to help decide on the successor, and takes most of his army with him. He leaves his trusted general Kitbuka with around 12,000 warriors to finish the job. Kitbuka had recently converted to Christianity, so he recruits some Christian soldiers from Armenia and Georgia to bulk up his army, and then begins preparations to invade Egypt. Qutuz gets word that Hulagu had left the area, and he and Baybars immediately ride out to force a battle with Kitbuka. They find the Mongols camped near a spring called Ain Jalut in Galilee. Baybars had spent time in the area as a fugitive and was familiar with the terrain, and he comes up with a battle plan to use the Mongols' own tactics against them. The bulk of the Mamluk army, commanded by Qutuz, is left hiding in the trees, and Baybars takes a small detachment to directly attack the Mongols. Baybars and his men charge the Mongol camp and harass them for hours with hit-and-run tactics. Every time the Mongols run out to fight, the Mamluks pull back closer and closer to Qutuz. Eventually, Kitbuka grows frustrated and he orders a full charge. This is exactly what Baybars had been waiting for, and he quickly orders his warriors to fall back. The Mongols, now enraged the Mamluks are again running away, blindly chase them, and Baybars and his men lead them directly to Qutuz. The trap had been set, and the Sultan gives the order. Qutuz's army emerges from the forest, and archers send a storm of arrows down onto the unsuspecting Mongol riders. The Mamluk heavy cavalry then makes a full charge and smash directly into the enemy line. Kitbuka and his warriors are initially shocked by this surprise attack, but they quickly regain their composure and begin fighting back. The battle is brutal, and the Mongols quickly prove that their reputation was well earned as they begin to savagely tear through the Mamluk army. Qutuz watches from a distance as his left flank begins to falter, and it appears that the Mongol forces are about to break through. His mind is flooded with memories of his childhood. He cannot let history repeat itself, and so, without a moment's hesitation, Qutuz abandons his post and charges headfirst into battle. As he rides, he throws off his helmet and shouts, "O Islam! O Allah! Grant your servant Qutuz a victory against these Mongols!" His warriors turn to see who is shouting and are shocked to see their sultan riding into battle to fight alongside them. Qutuz continues to charge forward. "O Islam!" He screams, and his words fill the Mamluks with renewed courage. They regain their composure and they begin to fight back. The battle rages on, with Qutuz now on the front lines, and soon the Mongols do something they had never done before. They begin to run in fear. Kitbuka cannot believe his eyes as his warriors flee past him. He tries to rally his remaining men, but it is no use. The Mongol general and those who stayed to fight are all slain in battle. Hulagu Khan receives word of the Mongol defeat at Ain Jalut and is enraged. He orders the execution of the last of his Ayyubid prisoners, but the damage had already been done. The illusion of the Mongol invincibility had been shattered. 5 days after the Battle of Ain Jalut, Qutuz and Baybars retake Damascus, and within a month, they also free Aleppo from Mongol control. 2 men who had been sold into slavery as children by the Mongols had pulled off what no one had ever dreamed possible. They had stopped the unstoppable horde from the east, avenged the Khwarezmian Empire, and saved the Muslim and Christian world. Throughout the following decades, the Mongols would attempt multiple invasions into Syria, but would be pushed back time and time again, until eventually the descendants of Hulagu themselves eventually converted to Islam. If you can't beat them, join them, I guess. As for Kutus, as epic as his story is, it ends on kind of a down note. As his army was riding back to Cairo to celebrate their victory at Ain Jalut, he was assassinated by a group of his own soldiers, probably under the orders of Baybars himself. What? Don't hate the player, hate the game.
It's August 15th, 1415, and a small army from England has arrived at the French port town of Harfleur. They're led by the newly crowned King of England, the 29-year-old Henry V, who's here on a mission. See, ever since his dad overthrew King Richard II, England had been divided, and when his father died, he inherited all of his problems. Nobles were still loyal to King Richard and were funding rebellions. The treasury was broke from wars with the Welsh. England was in desperate need of a king who could reunite the nation, and Henry decided that the best way to do this was to restart the 100 Years' War with France and take their throne as well. Henry has with him around 12,000 soldiers. His plan's simple. He'll claim a few French towns for England and sail back home a hero. Harfleur is his first stop, and he demands the citizens open the gates and surrender immediately. But for some reason, they don't listen. Henry begins a siege on the town on October 18th, and his trebuchets rip into the city walls. As he watches the destruction, the English king smiles at their defiance. Though he's young, he's faced much more formidable opponents in the past and has the scars to prove it. The French will regret ever challenging King Henry V. But what he thought was going to be an easy win drags on, and the French garrison at Harfleur fight back. Days drag into weeks, and the warm weather quickly turns the English camp into a swamp. Dysentery sweeps through Henry's army, and hundreds of his soldiers contract the dreadful disease. To speed up his conquest, Henry sends a challenge to the Dauphin, France's crown prince, to duel him in 1v1 combat, but he gets left on red with no answer. The king realizes he can't expect to win any battle with his entire army uncontrollably shitting themselves, so before all of his men contract the deadly doo-doo disease, Henry orders a full assault on the city. His men storm the walls, and they're barely beaten back. Spooked by the attack, the citizens of Harfleur decide to give up if no reinforcements arrive by the 23rd of September, and when no help arrives, they officially surrender on the 22nd. Henry had claimed his first official victory on French soil, the first English victory here in nearly 60 years. But he's distracted and can't celebrate. He had grand plans of quickly conquering the French coast, but he'd spent nearly the entire campaign season on just one tiny port town. His advisors urge him to sail home. It's growing late in the year and half of his army is sick. But Henry decides that Harfleur is not enough and he must do more. He sends his sickest men back to England and stations another 1,000 or so men to defend his newly acquired town. His army's now cut down to about 6,000 soldiers. 5/6 of his army are archers, and the rest are men-at-arms with no mounted knights. There's no way he can take another town with a force this small, but what he can do is rub it in the French king's face that he did steal this one. So Henry decides to take his remaining men and march them through France to the English-held port of Calais. He hopes this parade will establish his authority for everyone to see. But little did the young king know, the French were watching his every move, waiting for the perfect opportunity to go for his head. Henry and his small army set out from Harfleur on October 8th. They expect the journey to Calais to take around 8 days and bring the appropriate amount of food with them. In the shadows, a growing French army stalks the king and his men, and they realize he's heading towards the River Somme. The French quickly destroy all of the bridges over the river and defiantly block Henry's path. He's forced to travel south trying to find a way to cross, all the while the food supplies for his army dwindling and dysentery continuing to spread through his ranks. After marching for weeks, Henry finally leads his men across the Somme miles downstream from where he had originally intended to cross. They had long run out of food and are starving, but at least they're now marching on a path that will take them directly to Calais. But just when Henry thinks he's in the clear, the French army slowly begins to materialize in front of him. One by one, an endless stream of mounted knights ride out and form a line. The swarm of Frenchmen is unending, and eventually the opposing force is so vast, it's clear to everyone that the English are outnumbered at least 2-1. Henry turns to look at his men, and they are a sorry sight. They're dirty, tired, sick, and starving. In fact, his archers, who by this point were nearly all stricken with dysentery, had removed their pants after growing tired of constantly shitting themselves and were now standing there naked from the waist down like a mob of medieval Pooh Bears. An English man-at-arms looks out at the massive French army and begins to panic. He starts shouting how badly they're outnumbered. Henry turns to his men and quickly replies, "I would not, even if I could, have a single man more than I do." Do you not believe that the Almighty, with these his humble few, is able to overcome the arrogance of the French, who boast of their great number and of their strength? He swears to his men that he'll accept no ransom for his life. If they fall, he will die with them. The words of their king steel the English, and they prepare to fight. Henry quickly sends his accompanying priests to hear the final confessions of all his men, and the French watch from across the battlefield as the English soldiers kneel before the priests and confess their mortal sins. The last of his soldiers crosses himself and stands, and Henry marches his men out onto the battlefield. Both armies lock eyes in silence, neither side willing to make the first move. As the French shift their position, Henry expertly moves his small line to match them. As they jockey for position, the minutes stretch to hours, and soon night falls. The French begin to retreat back to the nearby villages, while Henry's men watch them in complete darkness. Suddenly, the sky opens up and freezing rain begins to fall. Henry and his men are quickly soaked to the bone, and they rush to take shelter under the nearby trees. As they listen to the sound of the wind and rain, they stare off into the cold night and see the warmth of the French bonfires flickering in the distance. The wind carries sounds of laughing and eating, which makes the men groan in envy. Henry orders his men to maintain complete silence. He announces that anyone who makes a single sound will have their ear cut off. As his men try their best to sleep through the storm, the king and his commanders stay up to carefully plan the battle to come. He's outmanned and fighting on enemy soil. Henry knows his plan must be perfect, or this miserable night will be the last for everyone here. The sleepless king watches the sun rise and carefully puts on his helmet. Affixed to the top is a shining gold crown with the marks of England and France. Like a lighthouse in the dark morning, the sun's rays dance proudly on the shining crown. The king will be unmistakable on the battlefield. He will not hide or command from the rear. He will fight and is prepared to take on anyone who comes at him. Henry mounts a tiny gray horse and rides out onto an area of the battlefield that he's chosen based on his recon missions throughout the night. The rain has turned the field into a thick sea of mud, and he brings his men to a spot where the forest on both sides of the field narrow in towards him. The king then begins to position his army. He places his men-at-arms in a thin line in the center. He positions his archers to each side and has them drive wooden stakes that point outward in front of their line. Throughout their march, Henry had forced his archers to make and carry these giant wooden stakes. At the time, the archers didn't know why they were forced to do this, but now it's very clear. If the French cavalry attempts to charge their position, they'll impale their steeds in the process. Henry then turns and sends 200 of his best archers to hide in the woods that line the battlefield. With preparations complete, he takes his position in the front and center of his army. With his banner flying in the wind, he waits. The French take their time arriving on the battlefield and begin lining up in a somewhat unusual formation. See, what Henry's unaware of is that as word spread through France of his march to Calais, more and more dukes and lords raced to join this French army. They all wanted the glory of defeating the English king, and because they outranked the professional soldiers who already were preparing for this battle, the nobles changed the battle plan and demanded to be placed on the front line. It'll now be a race to see who can take the king's head. The French front line of lords and nobles continues to swell, and as they push their way in front of each other, they confidently stare down the hill at the trapped English army. Back at the English line, Henry rides in front of his men, preparing them for battle.
Think to Edward III and the Black Prince and their great victories in this land. The story of our glorious battle today will soon forever join them.
And for you archers, the French told me that if they win, they're going to cut off the fingers you use to draw your bows. So you better, fight hard and stuff.
How dare they!
What does this mean? I don't know. Henry and his men stand ready for combat, but as the sun rises higher into the sky, the French seem completely uninterested in fighting. They have food, comfortable accommodations, and they know more troops are rushing to join this battle. Every day they wait, they grow stronger, and the English army grows weaker, and they know it. Henry realizes the French plan and has to think fast. He must force them into a fight, and with time running out, he has no good options. His army can't last another night in the rain, so he decides he'll risk everything here and now. He orders his men to prepare to advance. It dawns on the English that they'll be marching directly towards the enemy, and they all begin falling to their knees in prayer. They kiss the ground, surrendering their lives to God, and await the command. Henry watches and waits until the French are distracted by their lunchtime activities, and when he sees an opening, he shouts to his men,
St. George, this day help thine own!
His men shout a battle cry, and they quickly lift their stakes out of the ground and begin marching forward. As they move, Henry watches his enemy on the hill closely. His army's completely defenseless, and a cavalry charge now would instantly wipe them out. Every step inviting death, Henry and his men bravely trudge forward. A few French knights spot the English on the move and cannot believe their eyes. What kind of madman would do this? The French quickly begin to prepare themselves, but by the time they're ready to attack, it's too late. The English are now just 300 yards away from the French position, and they rush to replant their stakes into the ground. Henry quickly gives the command, and his archers unleash a torrent of arrows directly into the enemy line. The French knights are well armored, but taken completely by surprise. Arrows pound into their heads and chest, and the blunt force trauma of being struck by the powerful English longbow at this closer range knocks them off their feet. On instinct, the mounted French nobles at the front lead a counterattack, and they barrel towards Henry and his men. The mud is thick, and the horses' hooves get sucked deeper and deeper with every step. With the fire of 1,000 suns in their hearts and bowels, the English archers let loose wave after wave of arrows into the French knights, killing their horses and knocking them to the ground. They try to stand, but their heavy armor pulls them deeper and deeper into the thick mud, and many begin to helplessly drown. The surviving French horses, now spooked by the storm of arrows, begin to turn and trample the French men-at-arms who were following the knights' charge. Like bowling pins, they're knocked down and are quickly stomped face first deep into the mud by the hooves of the terrified horses. A small group of French knights do make it to the English line, but just as Henry had planned, many of their horses impale themselves on his wall of stakes. As more and more knights reach their line, the English archers throw down their bows and pick up the tools they'd use to craft their wooden defense and prepare for close combat. Henry gives the signal and chaos erupts as the entire English line pounce on the French knights. Mud is flying everywhere, and the archers are desperately driving their makeshift weapons into their opponents. Henry leads from the front, taking on every French noble that rushes in swinging at his head. The French vanguard behind the knights begin their charge and are met with heavy arrow fire from the archers hidden in the woods. The French men-at-arms who survive the fleeing horses and the hidden archers finally make it to Henry's army. They're completely exhausted, but their numbers are still great, and like a wave, they crash into the English men-at-arms. Henry's line is pushed back by the massive bodies, and feeling the desperation of the moment, Henry calls on his men to fight on. His men fight back with the desperation of trapped animals as the French are funneled by the tree line into the English line. The fighting is barbaric, with the English archers targeting any opening in the French armor they can find. Knives and stakes are driven into the eye holes of the French knights as they fight for their lives with their makeshift weapons. Henry looks up the hill and sees more French soldiers waiting to join the battle.
Hold the line, men! We must be prepared for their final charge!
Hey Jean, truth or dare?
Dare. Okay, I dare you to show your butt to the English!
What the fuck?
Oh, mon Dieu, that was so embarrassing. The French nobles, who desperately wanted to be the ones to defeat the English king, had ordered a large portion of their army to wait on the hill. But they had vastly underestimated Henry, and after 3 hours of brutal fighting, a pile of slain dukes and lords lay at Henry's feet. The English line had held, and they defiantly stand with their king gasping for air. The French commander of the rear guard stops sending men down the hill into the bloodbath, and the English take the surviving nobles and soldiers near them as prisoners. Henry, catching his breath, looks at his captives and then out at the French reserve army on the hill, trying to anticipate their next move. They're still outnumbered, and they've taken losses as well. If they send another wave down, can his men fight on? Suddenly, chaos breaks out behind him. A French lord and a small contingent of troops had managed to sneak behind the English. They're attacking the wagons that hold his crown, a piece of the true cross, and all of the treasure Henry had claimed on this expedition. Realizing they may be surrounded, his men begin to panic. The king needs to think fast. Without a stroke of genius, the effort and lives of his men could all have been for nothing.
Think, Henry, think. What should the King of England and France, the monarch chosen by God, do at a moment like this?
You, Kill all the prisoners!
Sire, I do not think that is an appropriate thing for us Christians to do to fellow
I'll do it! Ah! 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 Ah!
Oh yeah, that did it. Many of Henry's soldiers refused to follow this order, but some reluctantly began to cut down the prisoners they'd taken. The lords begged for their lives as they're unceremoniously executed. The French, watching from the hill, are horrified that the English king could commit such war crimes on fellow Christians, especially since it turns out the people looting the wagons were just local villagers, and the French army had already decided to give up by this point. The battle is over. Henry had lost 600 men in the fight, but his opponents had lost much, much more. Among the 5,000 Frenchmen who fell at Agincourt were most of the French nobility, including 3 dukes, 90 barons, and almost 3,000 knights. In a single battle, Henry had crippled France's leadership for decades to come. A herald from the French army comes down the hill, and Henry asks him if they accept his victory.
Yes, we accept it! The victory is yours! What is the name of that castle there?
That is the town of Agincourt.
Because all battles ought to bear the names of the nearest fortress to the place that they were fought, this battle will now and forever be known as the Battle of Agincourt.
It's actually pronounced Agincourt.
Battle of Agincourt!
Henry goes on to become unstoppable in the war against France, and by 1420 he has conquered his way to Paris. The French king Charles VI is forced to recognize him as regent, and Henry marries his daughter and is declared the next heir to the throne. He returns home and is celebrated by his people as a hero. Despite being so young, Henry had accomplished a lifetime of achievements. He'd united his people, legitimized his rule of England, and soon would be crowned King of France as well. But just before Henry's able to become the most powerful monarch in Europe, he dies of dysentery at the age of 35. Just 2 months later, King Charles VI dies, and Henry's young son, Henry VI, becomes the only British king in history to also hold the title of the King of France. While his son's rule in France was almost immediately challenged, Henry V is still widely remembered as one of the greatest kings of England, largely in part because of the upset he pulled off at the Battle of Agincourt.
It's actually pronounced Battle of Agincourt.
What happens when you're a good admiral, but your entire crew is made up of peasants who had never seen the ocean before? Today we're covering the Battle of Tsushima and what is probably the most embarrassing defeat in military history. It's the 18th century, and European colonialism is at its peak. The Americas, the Pacific, and now even Africa were all being swallowed up in a great land grab by the European empires of the time. The native populations throughout the world could do little to resist the invaders armed with modern weaponry, and conquering and subjugating foreign lands went from daring adventures to the expectation and the norm. While the rest of Europe were busy sailing around the world establishing colonies in exotic places, the Russian Empire instead headed east. The descendants of Genghis Khan, who once dominated the steppe, could do little to fight back against the might of the modern Russian army. And eventually, by the end of the 19th century, when he was crowned emperor, Nicholas II found himself the ruler of the largest contiguous land empire since the Mongols. Now, Nicholas, like everyone else in Europe at the time, was fully bought into the idea of European domination of the world. It wasn't the weapons or strategy, it was just that Europeans were better at, well, everything. But while all of this was going on, a tiny island nation called Japan had overthrown their samurai-led shogun government and placed an emperor back on the throne. In just 20 years, the land of the rising sun had rapidly modernized into the first true industrial power in Asia. And as they watched Europe claim lands across the world, they began to think, that does seem pretty sugoi. So in 1894, Japan goes to war with China. With their modern military, they curb-stomped the Qing dynasty so badly that they're forced to surrender within a year. Amongst their territorial gains, the Japanese claimed the warm water port known as Port Arthur on the Liaodong Peninsula. And when Tsar Nicholas finds out about it, he's not super happy. Hey, I was just about to take that! Sumimasen, Nicholas-san, I'm sure you can find another port.
But I wanted this one! Guys, the Japanese took the port I was gonna take.
But
We were the ones who beat the Chinese. Mine!
Germany and France both had their own ulterior motives in getting Russia to expand into Asia, but once they got involved in the dispute, the Japanese were forced to give Port Arthur back to the Chinese. But the Russians soon took it for themselves, which was kind of a dick move and made the Japanese pretty upset. Japan still desperately wanted the respect of Europe and really wanted to be a part of what it saw as the cool kids colonizer club. And so they signed a mutual defense pact with the UK, and in 1899, they joined the 8-Nation Alliance in the Boxer Rebellion, sending more troops than any nation to beat down the Chinese again. The Boxers were defeated, and Japan expected the Europeans to finally recognize them as an equal in the East. But Tsar Nicholas had other ideas. He leaves 100,000 of his troops in Manchuria, a sign of his colonial ambitions in the Far East. Not cool. That was the land the Japanese wanted to take. So Emperor Meiji sends diplomats to St. Petersburg to try to de-escalate tensions and work things out. But Nicholas considers Japan a nation of, and he actually said this, yellow monkeys, and so he doesn't even bother showing up to the meeting. At this point, the Japanese feel they have no other options. If Russia was trying to take Manchuria, what would be next? China? Korea? No, that would be unacceptable. If Russia thinks they can just walk in and colonize Asia, then maybe it's time for them to experience a little colonizing of their own. In the dark of the night, on February 8th, 1904, the Imperial Japanese Navy, under the command of Admiral Heihachiro Togo, launches a surprise attack on Russian forces in Port Arthur. The battle continues into the next day, and though neither side manages to sink any ships, the brazen attack by a small Asian nation against a European giant shocks the Russians. The formal declaration of war reaches St. Petersburg on April 10th, officially starting the Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese use ports in Korea to land their army for invasion, and Togo's fleet continues to keep the Russian Pacific Fleet divided between Port Arthur and Vladivostok. The Imperial Japanese Army is swift and engages the Russians at the Battle of Yalu River. The Russians are shocked by the ferocity of the Japanese soldiers, and they're pushed back deeper into Manchuria. The IJA press on towards Port Arthur, and sensing that things are getting bad, the Tsar sends his best admiral, Stepan Makarov, to lead the Pacific Fleet. Makarov is a charismatic leader, and he quickly takes action with aggressive moves against the enemy. His confidence inspires his men, and finally, the Russians have someone who can stand up and go toe-to-toe with the Japanese. The Japanese continue towards Port Arthur, landing more troops just 20 miles away in Dalny. As the pressure continued to mount, the Russian Pacific Fleet makes another attempt to break the blockade. But Togo pushes them back, and the admiral who had replaced Makarov dies in the engagement. With no one left to lead them, the remnants of the Russian Navy is forced to return to port and do their best to weather the siege from the Imperial Japanese Army. Taking Port Arthur was something very familiar to the Japanese. In the Sino-Japanese War, it took them just one day, but this time, the Russians, unlike the Chinese, had modern weapons like machine guns, and the siege quickly turned into a meat grinder. The Russians fought like their lives depended on it, because honestly, they kinda did. And in response, Japanese generals began sending their troops charging straight into defensive machine gun fire. The results were horrific, as wave after wave of Japanese soldiers were sent out, only to be cut down by the onslaught of bullets. By the end of it, the Japanese lost nearly 100,000 men, but in January 1905, they finally overwhelmed the exhausted defenders and took the port. The final remains of the Russian Pacific Fleet were then sunk in the harbor. Elsewhere, the Japanese army had pushed the Russians back to the city of Mukden. From February 20th to March 10th of 1905, 270,000 Japanese soldiers fought nearly 300,000 Russians in a battle that would remain the largest land battle in history until World War I. The speed of carnage was bone-chilling to all present. Never had so many humans died so quickly, and casualties soared to over 160,000 men. The Japanese emerged the victors, but at a heavy cost. They were too tired and their supplies too depleted to decisively end the war. The Russians, though badly beaten, would be able to send more reinforcements through the Trans-Siberian Railway. The Japanese knew they needed a knockout blow, and that responsibility would fall on the shoulders of Admiral Togo. He would not have to wait long for his opportunity. In October of the previous year, under the command of Admiral Rostetsvensky, the Russian Baltic Fleet, now renamed the Second Pacific Fleet, was ordered to leave Europe and sail to Asia to assist in the war. Rostetsvensky was a capable commander, probably the best choice Russia had under these circumstances. But there was just one problem. His crew was almost entirely made up of conscripted peasants who had never seen the water before, let alone fought on the open seas. It would be on him to not only lead this completely inexperienced crew on a voyage of 18,000 miles, but also to victory against a man who would go down in history as one of the greatest admirals of all time. All right, men, it's time for all of you to show Japan what Russia is made of. Yeah! What's a Japan? I don't know. Set sail! I told you idiots, the boats go in the water, not on the land. Sir, the Kamchatka is reporting they're seeing Japanese torpedo boats. We're all gonna die! We haven't left the Baltic Sea yet, you moron. Japanese torpedo boats! Japanese battleships! Why are they shooting at us? We're going down! Everybody panic! Stop, you idiots! Sir, we've lost the Kamchatka. Hey, we're back! Fought a bunch of Japanese ships out there. Barely made it out of there alive. Sir, message from the Kamchatka again. It reads, have you seen torpedo boats? We're all gonna die! There are no torpedo boats! Sir, we've arrived in Madagascar. Thank God. Now the idiots can't cause any more chaos. This is my new pet, Steven. Steven, no! Check out these magic cigarettes I bought. What is going on here? Show me those cigarettes. Oh my God. Okay, this is target practice. Shoot the target ship there. Be sure not to shoot the one towing it. I said don't shoot that one. Farewell, comrade. Who fired live rounds? The Kamchatka, sir? Message from the Kamchatka. They say they're sinking. Oh wait, they say they're fine now. Aw, man, that's fucking lame. Sir, we're approaching Japan. My God, we actually made it. The voyage from the Baltic Sea to Japan took 8 months, and against all odds, Rostetsvensky had arrived with all his ships intact. Exhausted from the journey, he planned a beeline right to Vladivostok through the Strait of Tsushima, and this is exactly what Togo was waiting for. In the early morning hours of May 27, 1905, the Baltic Fleet makes its way towards the Tsushima Strait. The hospital ship Aral sees what it thinks to be a friendly Russian boat and begins signaling to it that the Baltic Fleet has arrived. After all the false alarms throughout their 18,000-mile voyage, the Russians had finally encountered a real Japanese ship, and they didn't even know it. Admiral Togo was immediately notified that the Russian reinforcements had arrived, and he quickly sends a message to Tokyo to inform the emperor of what was to come. He boards his flagship, the Mikasa, and the Imperial Japanese Navy sets out to confront the last hope Russia has in this war. At 1340, both fleets see each other, and everyone begins preparations for the battle to come. At 1355, Togo signals a message to his entire fleet. The Empire's fate depends on the result of this battle. Let every man do his utmost duty. The Russians are first to open fire and target the Mikasa. Against all odds, Rostetsvensky's crew of peasants score hits on the Japanese flagship, and she is rocked. Togo turns his fleet parallel to the Russian ships, and they begin returning fire broadside to broadside. Shells explode on and around both fleets, but it quickly becomes apparent how much better the newer British-made Japanese ships and weaponry are. The Russian ships are literally blasted to pieces, and despite their best efforts, most of their ships are smoking and on fire within 30 minutes. The Oslabaya is the first casualty of the battle. It had taken too many hits and becomes the first modern battleship to be sunk by gunfire alone. Seeing the chaos spread throughout the Russian fleet, Togo issues the command that will turn him from an unknown Japanese admiral to a legend. As Rostetsvensky pushes his ships forward, Togo orders his ships to perform a maneuver called crossing the T. They steam forward in front of the Russian line and block their escape. Every cannon in the Japanese Navy now has a clear shot at the Russian ships leading the line, and they do not miss a beat. Togo commands his men to open fire, and it is a massacre. Rostatsvensky's flagship is hit, and he is seriously injured. Command of the Russian fleet is transferred to the Alexander III, but she is also hit. For the rest of the afternoon, the Russian fleet attempts to flee in any direction they can, with Togo and his disciplined navy following their every move. By sunset, 4 Russian battleships have sunk, and the remains of the fleet are separated into small packs, all desperately trying to reach Vladivostok. As darkness engulfs the sea, Togo sends out his torpedo boats, and they hunt down the remnants of the Baltic fleet like predators in the night. By the next morning, the surviving Russians find themselves surrounded by Togo. They wave the international surrender flag, but the Japanese admiral did not have a codebook with him that could decode the flag, and instead opens fire once again. The Russians scramble to find a white tablecloth and desperately begin to fly it to signal their surrender as they're hit with more shells. Finally, a Japanese sailor finds a codebook and identifies the original surrender flag being flown. The Russians, in desperation, take their own flag down and raise the Japanese flag instead, and Togo finally ceases fire and accepts the surrender of the Russian fleet. The outcome of the Battle of Tsushima rocked the world. This was the first time an Asian nation had ever defeated a European superpower in modern times, and the victory was not close at all. Only 3 Russian ships made it to Vladivostok, the rest destroyed or captured by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese lost just 3 torpedo boats in the battle. The morning of the 28th brings another surprise. A Japanese destroyer radios to Togo that they had found and captured Admiral Rostatsvensky alive. The Japanese are in disbelief and cannot believe the admiral did not go down with his ship. But his identity is confirmed, and he is brought to a hospital to treat his wounds. Sometime in the following days, Admiral Togo, dressed in plain clothes, pays a visit to his opponent. He sits at Rostatsvensky's bedside and politely says, "Defeat is a common fate of a soldier. There is nothing to be ashamed of in it. The great point is whether we have performed our duty." He shakes the admiral's hand and leaves. Rostatsvensky returns to Russia and takes full responsibility for his crew and the outcome of the battle. For his failures, he is sentenced to death by the courts, but is ultimately saved and commuted by Tsar Nicholas. He lives out the rest of his days peacefully with his wife. The defeat at Tsushima was the final nail in the coffin for the Russian war efforts, and the Tsar soon sues for peace. US President Teddy Roosevelt acts as a mediator for the surrender and wins himself a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. However, Roosevelt removed the war reparations to be paid to Japan, letting Russia off the hook. The Japanese had nearly bankrupted themselves winning the war and desperately needed the money that never came. This planted seeds of animosity towards the United States amongst the Japanese people, and these seeds would ultimately bear the fruit of another surprise attack that would take place about 40 years later. But for now, Japan had proved itself a formidable military power equal to the Europeans, and they were finally in the Cool Kids Colonizer Club. They quickly began colonizing the Pacific in a way that was even more brutal than the Europeans. Back in Russia, the humiliating loss in the Russo-Japanese War was the vodka bottle that broke the bear's back. And just 10 years later, Tsar Nicholas and the House of Romanov would be overthrown by revolutionists. A new communist government would come to power in Russia, and the world has never been the same since.
It's the year 1758, and Alapai, the king of the island of Hawaii, is troubled as he watches Halley's Comet streak overhead in the night sky. His kahuna had warned him that a fiery light in the sky would mark the birth of a special child, one who would grow to become a slayer of chiefs and would rule not just his island, but all the surrounding islands as well. Days later, Alapai's fears only grow when he learns that his niece has given birth to a boy. Believing that this may be the child of prophecy, Alapai sends his men north to find and execute the baby. But word travels quickly, and before they can reach the village, the chiefess entrusts her son to a relative who takes the infant deep into the mountains to be raised alone and in secrecy. The boy survives, and at the age of 5, when he's discovered to still be alive, he's welcomed back to the royal court. Having endured a life in isolation, the boy's name is changed to Kamehameha, the Lonely One, and he's entrusted to his uncle Kalaniʻopuʻu, who's tasked with teaching him the ways of the warrior and keeping a close eye on him as he grows. King Alapai dies, and Kalaniʻopuʻu is made the new ruler of Hawaii. His kahuna tells him that Kamehameha seems to be filled with supernatural levels of mana and will one day become a great warrior. Years pass, and the boy masters the Hawaiian martial arts and grows to a towering 7 feet tall. At the age of 14, he lifts the legendary Naha Stone, which is said to grant the mana needed to conquer all the islands to the man who can move it. All signs point to Kamehameha actually being the child of prophecy, and many chiefs begin to take notice. Word spreads as far as the distant island of Kauai of a mighty warrior on Hawaii, but the lonely one is content faithfully serving his uncle. But everything changes when strange ships appear off the coast that will change the course of history on the island forever. It's November 1788, and natives throughout the islands are busy celebrating and giving thanks to their god Lono for the bountiful harvest. This sacred time of the year known as Makahiki was filled with feasts, hula, and games to thank the god and to prepare the islands for his long-awaited return. The villagers in Kalaniʻopuʻu's village are enjoying the festivities when suddenly in the distance they spot a strange canoe sailing towards them. They run to shore to get a better look, and they see that on the canoe is a giant cross draped with white cloth that's billowing in the wind. There is no mistake. This canoe matches descriptions that have been passed down through generations. At long last, Lono has finally returned. The strange canoe anchors in Kealakekua Bay, and renowned British explorer Captain James Cook and his men board a small boat and row towards the crowd that's quickly amassing on the beach. As they take their first steps onto shore, the Hawaiians fall to their knees before these strange visitors. Kalaniʻopuʻu welcomes Captain Cook with great humility, and for a month, the king treats them to lavish meals and showers them with gifts worthy of a god. Cook and his men gladly accept the islanders' hospitality, and when they've restocked their supplies, they thank their hosts and set sail to explore the northern Pacific. The Hawaiians row their canoes next to the ships, escorting them away from the island, and wave to the explorers as their ships disappeared over the horizon. Their hearts were filled with gratitude that Lono had finally returned to celebrate Makahiki with them. Everything was perfect, until Cook came back. Sailing north, Cook's ships are caught in a storm, and he's forced to return to Hawaii for repairs. They sail back into Kealakekua Bay, and the welcome they receive this time is much different. Makahiki season was over, and the islanders wonder, why is Lono back again? The Hawaiians grow suspicious. Perhaps this man isn't Lono after all. Feeling deceived, they refuse to help Cook repair his ship and begin to aggressively pick fights with his crew. In response, Cook's men begin stealing supplies from the Hawaiians, and the Hawaiians retaliate by stealing a small boat the explorers were using to row to shore. For Cook, this was the last straw. If the natives will not cooperate willingly, then he will force them to. Early in the morning on Valentine's Day 1779, Cook and his men walk into the village and demand that Kalaniʻopuʻu come with them. Groggy and confused, the king rubs his eyes and takes Cook's hand, unaware of what's happening. As they walk back towards the British ship, one of the king's wives cries out for them to stop. Her voice alerts nearby chiefs, who quickly realize something is wrong. Cook and his men begin rushing the king toward their boat, while the chiefs shout for Kalaniʻopuʻu to stop and sit. A kahuna emerges holding a coconut and begins chanting aggressively at Cook. His words echo through the village, and the commotion draws everyone out to the shore. Kamehameha and his fellow warriors rush to join the crowd, weapons in hand, ready to fight. Cook orders his men to line the shore. They draw their rifles and aim into the crowd. A standoff ensues, with the Hawaiians growing angrier and angrier that their king is not being returned. A warrior steps forward and menacingly points his weapon at Cook, and on instinct, the captain draws his pistol and fires. The Hawaiians begin throwing stones at the explorers, and one of the Marines is knocked to the ground. Cook fires another shot into the crowd, this time killing one of the warriors. Enraged, the Hawaiians lunge at the captain, and his men open fire into the mob. Some of their musket balls find their mark, but before they can reload, the Hawaiian warriors have swarmed Cook and have forced him to the ground. As he tries to struggle to his feet, he's stabbed and clubbed to death. Cook's ship opens fire on the crowd, and the cannon fire quickly scatters the Hawaiians. The surviving sailors row back to their ships and leave the island for good. Though the brawl was short, Kamehameha was shaken by the sheer power of these foreign weapons. Cook's men were few, but if an army with these weapons were to return, would their warriors stand a chance? He thinks of the people who live on islands near them. They shared the same history, the same blood, but they have been at war with each other for generations. Divided like this, they will all fall. Someone must unite them so they can stand together as one. Silently, Kamehameha decides that when the time is right, he will be the one to do it. In 1782, King Kalaniʻopuʻu passes away. He leaves his kingdom to his son Kivalao and gives his nephew Kamehameha guardianship of the god of war Ku and control of Waipio Valley. Tensions instantly break out over who's the ruler of the land. The one with the blessing of Ku is the one who actually has the power to conquer all, and this convinces 5 warrior chiefs that Kamehameha is truly the child of prophecy. They pledge their loyalty to him, and to the new king of Hawaii, this is a direct challenge to the throne. His brother Keoua retaliates by cutting down sacred coconut trees in Kamehameha's land and killing some of his men, who he sacrifices to the gods for his brother. This act cannot go unpunished, so Kamehameha assembles his army and marches into Kivala'o's land. As Kamehameha's forces march through villages on their way to confront the king, women and children rush to seek shelter in protected sanctuaries, knowing that war on this island spares no one. Kivala'o gets word of this invasion, and he takes his army out to meet Kamehameha. The armies cross paths on a rocky field near Kealakekua Bay. The warriors taunt each other as kahuna on both sides begin chanting, calling upon the gods to grant them mana needed to secure victory. Now, blessed by the gods, war cries fill the air, and the armies charge each other. Kamehameha and his chiefs lead their army from the front lines and rush to engage Kivala'o's men. Combat is up close and brutal. Shark's tooth daggers tear into the flesh of their enemies, skulls are crushed by heavy clubs, and spears impale warriors caught off guard. In the chaos, Keoua, Kivala'o's brother, cuts down many of Kamehameha's men, challenging all who dare face him. In the heat of battle, one of Kamehameha's chiefs, a man named Kameamoku, is struck and falls to the ground. His bright feathered cape broadcasts his nobility for all to see, and it quickly draws the attention of Kivala'o. The king marches towards the fallen chief, weapon ready to finish him off. But just as he nears, a stone from one of Kamehameha's slingers slams into Kivala'o's head, dropping him to his knees. Kameamoku crawls toward him and slits his throat with a shark-toothed dagger. Kivala'o is dead, and his army retreats. Kamehameha removes the blood-stained royal cloak from the former ruler's body and lifts it for all to see, officially claiming his lands. But the deceased king's brother would not give up the island of Hawaii so easily. For the next decade, Kamehameha and Keoua wage a bitter war. Keoua wins many of the battles, and the island remains divided. Kamehameha's chiefs insist he is still the child of prophecy and that they will ultimately win, but doubt creeps in. How can he unite all the islands if he can't even conquer his own? He needs help, a blessing from the gods to tip the scales of this war in his favor. And the gods answer his prayers in the most unexpected way. Cook's discovery of the Sandwich Isles had literally put Hawaii on the map, and by 1790, traders en route across the Pacific had begun making stops to resupply and do business. Hearing news of this land, 2 American trading ships, the Eleonora, commanded by Simon Metcalf, and the Fair American, commanded by his son Thomas Metcalf, set out for the islands. The larger ship, the Eleonora, is the first to arrive and drops anchor in Kauai Bay, an area governed by Kamehameha's loyal chief Kameamoku, the guy who slit the previous king's throat. The chief boards the ship to greet the traders, and though we don't know exactly what he did, it was evidently something that Simon found so offensive that he has the chief tied up and flogs him as punishment. The Eleonora quickly departs Hawaii and sails to the island of Maui, where the locals there steal one of Simon's rowboats and disassemble it for its nails. Furious, the captain invites the villagers to come aboard his ship to trade. The natives load their canoes with food and goods and begin to paddle out towards the Eleonora. As they approach the ship, Simon commands his men to open fire, and cannonballs tear into the unsuspecting villagers, killing 100 of them and injuring 100 more. At the very same time, back on Hawaii Island, Simon's son Thomas, completely unaware of the horrible things his father has been doing, arrives in Kauai Bay aboard the Fair American, ready to trade. Kameamoku, who was still seething from the humiliation of the flogging by Simon Metcalf, boards the Fair American with his men and kills Thomas and nearly the entire crew. The only survivor is a man named Isaac Davis, whose courage in fighting back against the warriors had impressed the chief enough to spare his life. The Hawaiians loot the Fair American and take its cannon, weapons, and supplies and drag Davis back to their village as prisoner. Kameamoku sends word south to Kamehameha about what's happened at Kauai, and at the same time, Simon Metcalf returns to Hawaii and anchors near Kamehameha's village. Fearing retaliation for the attack on the Fair American, Kamehameha orders every one of his people to stop trading and avoid the ship entirely. Simon Metcalf sends a man named John Young to shore to ask about the whereabouts of the Fair American, and fearing he may discover the truth, Kamehameha captures him and holds him prisoner. A day passes, and unaware that Young had been captured, Simon Metcalf begins firing his cannons as a signal for the sailor to return to the ship. As the thunder of cannon fire echoes through the village, Kamehameha grows concerned that he'll soon need to lead his men into battle against these invaders and their terrible weapons. The chief and his warriors stand ready, but no one leaves the ship. By the next morning, Metcalfe is done waiting. He assumes Young is off playing with the villagers and decides to strand him on the island as punishment. The Eleonora sets sail for China, never to return, and Simon Metcalfe never learns of what happened to his son. Soon after, Kamehamoku brings Isaac Davis to Kamehameha's village where he meets John Young. The two foreigners are given a choice. Okay, I think he's saying we should teach him how to use these weapons? What if we don't? Okay, so first thing you want to do is swab the barrel. Gotta make sure there's no embers in there. Davis and Young began training Kamehameha and his men on how to operate their new weapons, and over time, the two foreigners developed a deep respect for the chief. They learned to speak Hawaiian and eventually become his loyal advisors. Now armed with Western weapons and a ship of his own, Kamehameha feels the time has come, and he sets out to challenge the most powerful man in all the islands. While Kamehameha was fighting for control of the island of Hawaii, the great king of Maui, Kahekili, had conquered the island of Oahu and now ruled over almost the entire island chain. He was an imposing figure, with half of his body tattooed from head to toe. His conquest of the islands had been brutal, and all who had resisted met gruesome ends. Kahekili established his new seat of power on Oahu and entrusted his homeland of Maui to his son, the Prince Kalanikupule. Kamehameha saw this shift in power as his moment to strike. He and 5,000 of his warriors board war canoes and set sail for the island of Maui. Landing in Kahului, they march inland towards Wailuku, where they find Kalanikupule and his army standing ready to meet them. The formalities of war quickly begin as both sides prepare themselves for battle. The kahunas chant their last words, and war cries pierce the air as the two armies barrel towards each other. As the Maui warriors rush forward, Kamehameha's men fire a volley of musket balls that rip into Kalanikupule's front line. The prince watches his men fall and is appalled that Kamehameha has stooped to using foreign weapons against fellow islanders. He urges his men to fight, and they charge to meet the invaders. Blood sprays across the battlefield as the warriors clash with shark-toothed daggers, spears, and clubs. For 2 days, neither side could gain the upper hand. On the third day, Kamehameha summons his newest royal advisors to the battlefield, and they bring out a weapon Kalanikupule's men had never seen before. As the warriors of Maui watched the strange white men take position, a thunderous explosion echoed through the valley. Young and Davis fire the cannon taken from the fair American directly at Kalanikupule's unsuspecting forces. The cannonball tears through his ranks as the prince stood frozen, horrified by its destructive power. Kamehameha's men follow with a round of musket fire, and more of his warriors fall around him. The cannon continues to pound the warriors of Maui, and the prince, now taking heavy casualties, is forced to pull his men back deeper and deeper into the Iao Valley, with Kamehameha stalking them like a predator chasing wounded prey. The Maui forces are pushed back to Iao Stream, and with no other options, they make their last stand. Young and Davis fire their cannons again and again, and within hours, Kalanikupule's army is completely obliterated. Their ravaged bodies are thrown into the water behind them, and they pile up in numbers so great the river itself slows to a trickle stained red with blood. When the smoke clears, Kamehameha's forces stare out at a massive bodies and name this battle Kepanivai, the damming of the waters. In the chaos, Kalanikupule manages to sneak away and sails back to Oahu to raise another army. Kamehameha boards his canoes ready to follow him. But just as he's about to leave, he receives word that his land in Hawaii is once again under attack from Keaua. Kamehameha realizes before he can conquer Oahu, he must stomp out this uprising in his home once and for all. He and his warriors voyage back to Hawaii, and they quickly clash with Keaua's forces. But once again, Kamehameha is unable to secure a decisive victory, and the rebels retreat through the Kau Desert that skirts the Kilauea volcano. As the exhausted army trudges through the wasteland, a deep rumbling from beneath their feet grows louder and louder. Suddenly, the earth splits open and lava erupts all around them. The air is filled with poisonous gases, and many of Kioa's men collapse, gasping for air. Others try to continue onward, casting footprints in the molten lava that had surrounded them. Nearly his entire army was wiped out by the eruption, and now it seemed that even Pele, the goddess of fire, had chosen Kamehameha as the true ruler of the island. The following year, Kamehameha offers a peace treaty to the defeated prince. Keaua knows his cousin was not someone who would offer such a thing, but resigned to defeat, he accepts the invitation, and just as he expected, upon arrival, he and his men are executed on the spot. I knew it. Kamehameha is now king of Hawaii Island, and Kahekili recognizes him as a serious threat. Both kings begin preparations for the inevitable clash. They trade for stockpiles of Western weapons and forge alliances with foreign powers to support them in the coming war. But before Kahekili is able to attack Hawaii, he dies, and his empire is split between his two sons Kalanikupule and Kaeyokulani. Both brothers believe they deserve the entire empire, and they go to war with each other for full control of their father's lands. Their armies suffer heavy losses, and in the end, Kaeyokulani is killed in battle. Kalanikupule becomes the sole successor to the great Kahekili, but he is severely weakened. Kamehameha knows that this was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. He'd already defeated Kalanikupule once at Kapanivai. The time to unite the islands is now. So, in 1795, Kamehameha sets sail with 10,000 warriors, and they arrive on the shores of Oahu near Waikiki. Large, powerful tattooed men wearing loincloths push modern cannons to shore. Chiefs adorned with feather capes inspect their muskets, preparing for battle. To a time traveler, the army is one that seems lost in time. They spend a few days gathering supplies in Waikiki and then head west in search for Kalanikupule. They soon find his army, dug in at a defensive position near the mountain Puawaina, the hill of human sacrifice, known today as Punch Bowl Crater. Over the past 5 years, Kamehameha hasn't just adopted Western weapons into his army, he had absorbed Western military strategy as well. He sends half of his men to flank Kalanikupule, while he creates a diversion and engages them in a frontal assault. But before he can issue his commands, explosions ring out in the distance and cannonballs crash down near Kamehameha's forces. He looks up and spots a familiar face. Once a trusted ally, the chief Kaiana had defected and was now fighting for the enemy. Kamehameha gives the signal, and Davis and Young answer back with a thunderous cannon barrage of their own. His warriors charge forward towards Kaiana's position. The battlefield becomes a blend of old and new. Kamehameha's warriors push their spears forward in a European pike formation, while cannons and muskets ring out behind them. Other fighters break free to engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat with ancient weapons. Kaiana and Kalanikupule are pushed back to a secondary defensive position where more cannons are waiting. As Kamehameha's men charge, they're hit with heavy fire and take serious casualties. The defenders celebrate the small victory. Though they're outnumbered, Kaiana thinks they may be able to pull off the upset. But suddenly, war cries break out behind him. Kamehameha's flanking army had finally arrived. They hit the defenders hard, and the Oahu cannons are caught completely off guard. Kaiana turns to fight off the attackers, and in the chaos, Davis takes aim and sends a cannonball directly at the traitor chief, blowing a hole through his chest. Kalanikupule is also injured and flees the battlefield. His army falls into disarray and they begin to run. Kamehameha's men show no mercy chasing the fleeing warriors through Nu'uanu Valley all the way to a cliff. With nowhere to run, the last of Kalanikupule's army are pushed closer and closer to the edge. Realizing that all hope is lost, many begin jumping off the cliff in a desperate attempt to escape. A few try to fight back, only to find themselves pushed off by force. When the last of the Oahu warriors had fallen, Kamehameha's men looked down below and named the battle Kalele Ka'anae, the leaping mullet, after the men who voluntarily leapt to their end. A century later, during the construction of the Pali Highway, 800 skulls of those warriors were discovered at the base of this cliff. Kalanikupule goes into hiding but is eventually found and sacrificed to the gods by Kamehameha, officially ending the Kingdom of Maui. Now, only the island of Kauai remained free of his rule. For the next 15 years, Kamehameha attempted to invade and conquer the island, but is repeatedly stopped by the forces of nature. First, a storm sinks his canoes and forces him to turn back. On his second attempt, an outbreak of cholera wipes out a large part of his army before they could even set sail. In 1810, as he prepared for his third invasion attempt, the king of Kauai, Kamuali'i, realizes that war would only lead to more bloodshed and offers his island as a vassal state to the king. Under the guidance of his kahuna, the Lonely One accepted this offer and made peace with Kauai. His chiefs, on the other hand, hated this idea and decided in secret that they should still kill the guy just in case. Isaac Davis personally found this betrayal revolting and goes to warn the king of Kauai, who decides to skip the celebratory feast and immediately sails back home, leaving the chiefs with all that poison but no one to use it on. Okay, Davis, since our royal guest from Kauai didn't show up, I guess you can be the lucky one to eat his specially prepared royal food instead. What makes it special? Oh, you'll see. Drink up. Davis mysteriously died of poisoning that night, but after nearly 30 years of war, Kamehameha had finally fulfilled the prophecy of his childhood. After centuries of war, peace had finally come to the islands, and for the first time, they were united as one. He names his new kingdom the Kingdom of Hawaii after his home island, and in just a few decades, his descendants, the royal house of Kamehameha, transformed the humble kingdom into a modern world power recognized as equals by the great kings and queens of the world. Though the Hawaiian monarchy was ultimately illegally overthrown and annexed by the United States in 1893, the legacy of Kamehameha the Great lives on, and he's still celebrated throughout the islands and by native Hawaiians throughout the world to this day. Oh, and some guy in Japan named a special move after him in the manga he was writing. The Combat of 30. It's April 30th, 1341, and Duke John III of Brittany is lying on his deathbed. Surrounding him, his closest family and allies are all deeply troubled. See, John never had any children, and there's a lot of confusion on who's supposed to take his place as ruler. They ask him over and over again, "Who will rule after you are gone? Who?" John coughs and turns, and the people around grow silent. Shh, he's gonna say something.
For God's sake, leave me alone and do not trouble my spirit with such things.
And then he dies. John dying without declaring an heir to the throne was a huge mistake and led to two of his relatives, his half-brother Jean de Montfort and the husband of his niece Charles of Blois, both claiming to be the rightful heir. And this family feud quickly spirals into what would become known as the Breton War of Succession. The English and the French both see what's happening in Brittany, and having just started their own 100 Years' War a few years earlier, they quickly begin to meddle and turn the War of Succession into a proxy war, with the French backing Charles of Blois and the English backing Jean de Montfort. After a few years of intense fighting, the Pope comes in and negotiates a temporary peace between all parties in Brittany, and it's during this Pope-induced timeout that one of the most brutal brawls in human history began. See, there are these two areas in Brittany, Josselin, commanded by a Breton knight named Jean de Beaumanoir, and Pluimel, controlled by English knight Robert Bemborough. These towns are only 8 miles apart, so the French-backed forces regularly clash with the English during the war. But now that war is in a timeout, and these knights are getting restless. Without fighting, they can't show off how chivalrous they are, and if they can't show off how chivalrous they are, how are they supposed to get famous and bag a hottie? So one day, Beaumanoir travels to Pluimel, and from outside the castle gates, shouts to Bemborough, challenging him to a duel. It would be a good chance to up our honor, at least for whoever wins, of course. Bemborough thinks and issues a counteroffer. "Rather than a duel, let us have a tournament. Take 20 to 30 of your men and I'll do the same, and we'll meet at a beautiful field where nobody disturbs us." No prize money, just the opportunity to fight to the death to prove who were the greatest knights of Christ. You son of a bitch. I'm in. This sounded epic to Beaumanoir, so he accepts the challenge. The rules for their display of chivalry are set. Each side will have 30 men, and they'll fight each other without any reinforcements until one side's warriors are all dead, disabled, or captured. Most importantly, nobody's allowed to run away. And with that, the two men go about recruiting their teams. Beaumanoir recruits a mixture of knights and squires from Brittany, who all support France, and Bemborough's team consists of English knights, German mercenaries, and a handful of Bretons who support the English rule. So on March 26, 1351, both sides each attended Mass and went to confession to absolve their souls. Now that they can beat the shit out of each other without worrying about going to hell, Beaumanoir and Bemborough march their warriors to a midpoint between their fortresses called Half Oak, bringing with them a throng of spectators and refreshments. The combatants choose their weapons: axes, spears, hammers, and swords, and all the participants mount their horses and form two lines facing each other. A signal is given and both sides charge full speed at each other. The crowd erupts as the two lines meet, and the deafening clang of weapons on armor echoes throughout the field. Some men are knocked off their horses and are quickly met with a warrior from the opposite team frantically swinging their weapon at them, trying to kill them. All the men eventually find themselves on the ground, squared up in pairs, and 30 simultaneous savage duels begin. The fighting is dirty and barbaric, with blood and mud being thrown everywhere. The women in the crowd start to get grossed out. Is this what chivalry is supposed to look like? A French warrior is slain and is quickly followed by two on the English side. After an hour or so, everyone's dirty and exhausted, and someone calls for a timeout. Both sides agree, and both teams go back to their side of the field to repair their armor and weapons, bandage their wounds, and get some refreshments. Eventually, the combatants, still bleeding, battered, and bruised, take the field again and charge at one another. A French squire squares up against Bemborough and thrusts his spear through his head. Bembero, mortally wounded but unaware of just how bad he looks, tries to stand, and another French knight rushes in and slices him with an axe, killing him on the spot. With Bembero down, a mercenary on the English team takes command and they regroup and fight back fiercely. Beaumanoir is injured in the English rally and is thrown to the ground. He begs for water, and a knight near him shouts, "Drink your blood, Beaumanoir, your thirst will pass." Exhausted again, the two sides call for another timeout and retreat to their corners of the field. The break doesn't do much to recharge the batteries of the combatants. At this point, they've been fighting to the death in full armor for hours, and they're all completely gassed. On top of this, most of the crowd is either grossed out, bored, or walking away. Remember, there's no big payday for all of this. This is all to prove who's the most chivalrous here. They lurch back onto the battlefield, now clinching and trying to stab each other with daggers and swords. Men are sloppily falling to the ground in exhaustion. It's at this point a French knight decides that the rules of this match are stupid and he wants to go home, and he gets on his horse and rides onto the battlefield. He charges straight into the biggest pile of people and steamrolls 5 English knights, which collapses their line. The French team swarms in, and soon the remaining English warriors surrender. 9 of the English team's warriors and 5 on the French team lie dead on the battlefield. Everyone else is severely injured with broken bones and deep lacerations. The remaining English team is brought back to Josselin and held for a small ransom. Surprisingly, the survivors of the combat of the 30 all did in the end get what they wanted, as the story of their brawl quickly spread throughout Europe. Many were treated as celebrities after the fight, and one even went on to marry a princess. So I guess it all worked out. Except, the French side kinda cheated. The Attack of the Dead Men. It's 1915, and the horrors of modern warfare are on full display throughout Europe in the Great War. New weapons are being deployed into combat on a daily basis with horrific, never-before-seen results, and this story is no exception. The German army has begun its advance into the Eastern Front and has its sights set on Ozovik Fortress, a stronghold near the western border of the Russian Empire. This fortress was an extremely important choke point, as it controlled one of the only rail lines into the area. The Germans had been attempting to take Ozovik since the previous year, but had met heavy resistance from the Russian defenders stationed there. Though often outnumbered 10-1, the Russians have managed to hold the fort through 2 aggressive assaults with a fighting force of only around 900 soldiers and militia. By late summer, German Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg demanded that Ozovik be taken by any means necessary. And so, on August 6th, when the winds were favorable, the Germans unleashed a horrific new weapon on the men within the fortress walls. At 4 a.m., the Germans began firing their artillery at the fortress, and the Russian defenders braced for impact. They'd lived through this before, and it seemed like another routine bombardment. But on this morning, a mysterious green fog slowly began to creep its way past the trenches and into the fort. When the mist reaches the Russians, their eyes begin to burn. They start coughing uncontrollably, and as they take painful breaths of the green fog, their lungs quickly fill with blood. In a panic, a soldier turns and sees his comrade collapsing to the ground in a painful coughing fit, blood streaming from his eyes, nose, and mouth. The Germans had used chlorine gas against the helpless defenders, which on contact with soft tissue turns into hydrochloric acid. The Russians had no gas masks and were literally being dissolved alive by the deadly green fog. Men stationed near the back of the fort scrambled to douse pieces of cloth with water and urine and wrap their faces in a desperate attempt to survive the gas attack. But it proved futile, and within minutes the 900 defenders all appeared to be dead on the ground. An hour or so later, the Germans donned their gas masks and began their march into the fort. As they neared the trenches, they were greeted by the horrifying effectiveness of their new chemical weapon. Bodies of dead Russian soldiers lay twisted in agony, all seeming to have passed choking on their own blood. Their hopeless attempts at makeshift face masks stained red cling to their faces. Their blinded eyes, raw like ground meat, stare into the sky, unable to be closed again. These German soldiers had never experienced the horrors of chemical warfare up close and are completely disturbed by its inhumane results. But as they march into the fort, they begin to hear rustling from amongst the dead bodies. Haunting groans followed by gurgling deep coughs begin to echo throughout the fort, and slowly, one by one, the once dead Russian soldiers begin to drag themselves to their feet. The Germans step back in disbelief as they watch the corpses of the defenders seemingly come back to life, blood streaming from their eyes and nose, and their painful coughs send bloody pieces of lung flying out of their mouths. The undead Russians, clutching their bayonets, slowly begin lurching forward as if possessed by vengeance itself. Suddenly, defensive artillery fire echoes out, and the Germans look up to see more undead men manning the cannons. The reanimated Russians begin charging at the Germans, who all turn and run in a full-blown panic. The undead defenders open fire on the fleeing German soldiers, and hundreds are shot down. Some are so desperate to flee from the sight of these unholy warriors that they impale themselves on the barbed wire lining the trenches, and many more are trampled to death by fellow soldiers running in horror. The German army retreats from Ozevik, and the siege is called off. The fortress remains in Russian hands. Though the 60 or so Russian defenders who survived the gas attack most likely met their end shortly following their last stand, they lived long enough to see Ozevik successfully defended for one final time. The fort was never taken by force. Instead, the Russians dismantled it. The Siege of Sigitvar. The year's 1565, and the Ottoman Empire has quickly grown into one of the greatest empires in history. Under the leadership of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans have steamrolled their way westward and now find themselves on the doorstep of Europe. He sets his sights on Vienna, the last line of defense to the European continent and home to the rulers of the mighty Habsburg Empire. Throughout his 4-decade reign, Suleiman has truly lived up to his nickname, but now in his 70s, his health has begun to fail. If he was to make a play to invade Europe, it needs to be done now. So on April 29, 1566, he assembles his army and begins his final march towards Vienna. But on his way there, his troops run up on this small fortress called Sigitvar that refuses to surrender. The fortress is commanded by a man who'd been a constant thorn in his side, the Croatian Count Nikola Zrinski. Now by this time, Zrinski and Suleiman were very familiar with each other. Zrinski had played a key role in defending Vienna when the Ottomans first attacked in 1529 and had been a part of many successful defenses against Suleiman's forces. As a faithful Christian, he hated the Ottomans and had devoted his life to guarding Europe from their rule. Knowing that Zrinski was stationed at this fortress, Suleiman orders his men to stop and set up camp. They'll take Sigitvar in a few days and crush this annoying pest once and for all before marching on Vienna. So on August 1st, Zrinski looks out at this mass of Ottoman soldiers piling up across the moat of his fortress, and he knows things are going to get bad real quick. He has with him just 2,300 Croatian and Hungarian defenders. Even if he were to send for reinforcements, they would still be no match for such an enormous army. More likely than not, his fate is sealed. But perhaps not the fate of Vienna and the Habsburgs. While he may not survive the upcoming siege, there's a chance he can stop Suleiman here and ensure he never reaches Vienna. Zrinski calls his men together, who by this time had all seen the Ottoman army outside their fort. He reminds them that it's their duty to fight to the last man against these invaders, and that he'll personally shoot any coward or deserter. Unsurprisingly, they all swear to defend the fort to the end. Now, to really get a feel for this epic battle to come, you have to understand the weirdness of the Sigitvar fortress. See, Sigitvar was in fact 3 islands, each with a separate fort: the New Town, the Old Town, and the Citadel. The only way to the Old Town is on a bridge from the New Town, and the only way to the Citadel is the bridge from the Old Town. If the Ottomans want to take the fortress, they'll have to break through Zrinski's defenses 3 times, and he was planning to make it as painful as possible. Suleiman's entire army shows up to Sigitvar on August 5th, and the sheer mass of men is a terrifying sight for the defenders. 100,000 soldiers and 300 cannons surround the fortress. But in defiance, the defenders drape bright red cloth from the fortress walls, sarcastically welcoming the Sultan's men as guests of honor, followed by a single cannon shot fired directly at the Ottoman army. A message so clear that it needs no translator. If you want this fort, you'll have to come and take it. The Ottoman siege begins on August 6th, and their cannons quickly rip apart the new town. Against all odds, Zrinski's defenders are able to return fire and successfully stop the first assault, inflicting heavy casualties on the Ottoman attackers. But this victory is short-lived, and a large part of the new town walls crumbles on August 9th, forcing Nikola's troops to retreat across the bridge into the Old Town. Despite his rapidly deteriorating health, Suleiman personally arrives to Sigitvar the same day. He wants to be there to see Zrinski's death with his own eyes. The Ottomans quickly set up their forces in the new town and begin their assault on the Old Town on August 10th. Cannons and artillery pepper the walls of the fort from all directions, and Suleiman's generals order full assaults at the Old Town main gates. Zrinski's forces repel the unrelenting assault 10 times, inflicting heavy casualties on the invaders, but ultimately the Old Town falls on August 19th, and Zarinsky's men are forced back into the citadel. Some of his troops near the front line are jumped as they're rushing towards the final bridge and are forced to watch in despair as the gates close on them. By this point, the Ottomans have sustained far greater losses than they anticipated, but Zarinsky's forces have suffered greatly as well. Only 600 of the 2,300 defenders have survived. Suleiman, sensing his time was short, begins to send messages to Zarinsky asking him to surrender. He promises him rule over all Croatia if he just gives up and turns his back on the Habsburgs. But his offer falls on deaf ears. With no response, the Ottomans begin to fire letters into the citadel, promising Zarinsky's troops that if they surrender, their lives will be spared, but not a single man leaves. With diplomacy a complete fail, the Ottomans resume their assault and manage to blow a massive hole into the wall of the citadel. Buildings on the last island catch on fire in the explosion, and Zarinsky and his men steel themselves for a final defense. But surprisingly, no attack comes. See, unknown to the defenders, a wave of dysentery has swept through the Ottoman camp, probably from drinking the nasty-ass water around the fortress. Suleiman himself, who is already incredibly frail, reportedly contracts the same infection and dies in his tent on September 6th. His commanders issue no orders that day and keep his death a secret from everyone, afraid that after such heavy losses, the rest of their army may begin deserting if they know their sultan is also dead. But Zarinsky and his men are not granted much time to rest. On September 7th, the day after Suleiman's death, the Ottoman army makes a final push to take the citadel. Greek fire spreads on the walls, setting the fort on fire, and cannonballs and arrows rain into the fortress onto the hapless defenders. Realizing they have no chance of victory, Zarinsky gathers his remaining men and says, "Let us go out from this burning place into the open and stand up to our enemies. Who dies, he will be with God. Who dies not, his name will be honored. I will go first, and what I do, you do. And God is my witness, I will never leave you, my brothers and knights." Zarinsky and his men push one of their last mortars to the front gate. Without warning, they fling it open, startling the Ottoman soldiers waiting on the bridge and fire directly into their formation. He then leads his remaining 600 men in a final charge out of the fort and down the bridge. The defenders of Sigedvar will go out in a final blaze of glory. Zarinsky, leading the pack, is hit with a bullet and then another and slumps to the ground dead. His men stream around their beloved commander, shouting their battle cries as they engage the enemy. Their final charge does not last long, and they are all soon put down. The Ottomans, sensing victory is at hand, charge into the open gates of the citadel, eager to take out the remaining defenders. But instead of defenders, they're greeted by a single wounded soldier sitting on the ground holding a torch. When the Ottomans reach him, he lights the remaining gunpowder supply, triggering a massive explosion, killing another 3,000 of the Sultan's men. What was supposed to be a short detour on their triumphant march to Vienna had instead cost the Ottoman Empire over 20,000 men and their Sultan. Suleiman's successors would never reach Vienna, and his death at Sigedvar marked the beginning of the downfall of the empire itself. Battle of Sargari. It's the closing years of the 19th century, and in an area of the Indian northwest frontier, the British Indian Army have found themselves under increasing attacks from local Afghan tribes. Though once allies to the crown, these tribes have begun to sour on the increasing British presence in the area, and now see the encroachment as a violation of their sovereignty. To defend their newly acquired territory, the British Indian Army had repurposed forts built by the conquered Sikh Empire near the Khyber Pass, and stationed members of the 36th Sikhs, an infantry regiment made up of Sikh soldiers from the Punjab region, to man these forts. In the fall of 1897, two forts in particular, Fort Gulliston and Fort Lockhart, find themselves under heavy assault from these tribes. Despite being outnumbered, the British Indian forces had been able to beat back the tribes each time, leaving them frustrated and looking for an easier target. And this is when they set their sights on a small outpost in the tiny village of Sargari. See, the two forts were miles apart and communicated through a Morse code via a signaling station in a small fort in Sargari. Messages from Gulliston were sent to Sargari, which was then sent to Fort Lockhart and vice versa. The Afghan tribesmen realized that if they knocked out the signaling station, the two forts would no longer be able to coordinate their defensive reinforcements properly. Now, Sargari was barely a village, and the signaling station rarely saw any action, so just 21 men were stationed there. Despite being on the front line, this outpost was boring AF. But all this changed on the morning of September 12, 1897, when the soldier manning the signaling tower spots a horde of Afghan tribesmen suddenly appear on the horizon. He quickly sends a message to Fort Lockhart that Saragari is under attack and requests reinforcements, but the reply is swift and it sinks the hearts of all men stationed there. All available forces are too far away, and the other forts can't be left unmanned. No reinforcements will be coming. Fort Lockhart then signals Saragari they count an estimated 10,000 tribesmen bearing down on their location. It's at this point, Havildar Ishar Singh, commander of the outpost, instructs his 20 soldiers that they'll fight to the end and do their best to stop the advancing horde. Though they will most likely die here today, they may be able to buy enough time for reinforcements to reach the other 2 forts. Staring death in the face, each man solemnly accepts his fate and springs into action. They quickly reinforce the gates to the fort, taking their positions on top of the wall, and wait anxiously as the giant wave of tribesmen gets closer and closer. The soldier stationed at the signaling tower remains at his post, observing the action, and will send updates to Fort Lockhart through the entire engagement. At 9 a.m., the tribesmen rush the fort, and the fighting begins. The Sikh are deadly marksmen, and the advancing tribesmen quickly begin to fall. But no matter how many bullets find their mark, the mass of attackers doesn't seem to change. From the sea of bodies, the tribesmen fire back at the soldiers on the wall and manage to kill one of the defenders. Against all odds, the Sikhs push back the first wave, and the tribesmen retreat and regroup. There's little time to celebrate as another wave of Afghans soon begins storming the fort. The Sikhs take out more attackers, but the tribesmen are closer and manage to take out more defenders with small arms fire from the ground. Every defender lost is a huge blow to a fighting force of just 21 men. But they sell their lives at the highest price, each taking out dozens of tribesmen before meeting their end. Eventually, the Afghans, quickly growing tired of being murked so effectively, begin shouting out to the Sikhs, "We offer you wealth and safety, just give up the outpost!" But their bribes are quickly answered with bullets. The tribesmen, frustrated with their failed attempts at both siege and diplomacy, begin to set the brush around the fort on fire, creating a dense veil of black smoke. The defenders struggle to see their enemy in the darkness when the signalman sees a frantic message being signaled from Fort Lockhart. The tribesmen have used the cover of the smoke to sneak around the fort to the undefended signaling tower and are making their way in. The wall near the signaling tower is soon breached, and screaming tribesmen begin to flood into the fort. Ishar sends some of the remaining men to defend against the breach, but this leaves the front gates vulnerable, and soon tribesmen have broken through and begin flooding in from the front. Running low on ammunition, the Sikhs resort to bayonets and swords. The men in Fort Lockhart helplessly watch through spyglasses as brutal hand-to-hand combat erupts within the fortress walls. The Sikh soldiers fight on bravely against impossible odds, but one by one begin to fall. Ishar commands his remaining men to retreat into the inner walls. As they run past him, he defiantly stands in the way of their attackers. His final moments are spent heroically engaging the horde of tribesmen, buying his men just enough time to retreat and lock the gates behind them. With Ishar slain, the Afghan mob storms to the inner walls. The defenders spend the little ammo they have left, but it's no use. Within minutes, the final gates protecting the survivors are broken, and the remaining Sikhs are all brutally killed. The only man left in Sargari is the lone soldier in the signaling tower, who at this point sends his final message to Fort Lockhart. Permission to take up my rifle. The commander of Fort Lockhart solemnly closes his eyes and replies, "Granted." He watches the signalman neatly pack up his equipment into a leather pouch and affix his bayonet to his rifle. The lone survivor then proceeds to take out 40 more tribesmen who try to attack his position. The men in Lockhart cheer him on with every kill, but the last ounce of hope is soon lost when a thick black smoke engulfs the tower. The tribesmen had set fire to the tower itself, and the last defender in Sargari is burned alive, shouting the Sikh battle cry for all to hear.
One will be blessed eternally, who says that God is the ultimate truth.
The last stand at Sargari lasted 6 hours, and against all odds, the 21 brave Sikh soldiers managed to buy enough time for reinforcements to arrive at the 2 forts the following day, and when the tribesmen attempted to attack the forts, they were easily beaten back. The British forces reclaimed the remains of the Saragari signaling outpost and found the mutilated bodies of the 21 men surrounded by over 600 dead tribesmen. Havildar Ishar and his men stationed at Saragarhi were posthumously awarded the Indian Order of Merit, the highest award an Indian soldier could receive at the time and was equivalent to the Victoria Cross. Siege of Agar. It's 1526, and Suleiman the Magnificent, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, has just plunged Central Europe into chaos. At the Battle of Mohacs, Suleiman personally led his forces into battle against the army of the 20-year-old king of Hungary, Louis II. In just one afternoon, the Sultan's forces completely obliterates the entire Hungarian army, and thousands of nobles die in the battle. The young king tries to escape the massacre, but he falls from his horse and drowns in a river. With Hungary's leadership and army crushed, Suleiman expected the territory to quickly fall right into his hands. But what happened next would change the course of the Sultan's life forever. See, while the Ottoman Empire was becoming the dominant power in the East, the House of Habsburg, through marriage, war, and a bit of luck, had become the most powerful family in Europe. By the 16th century, the Habsburgs controlled Austria, Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and one of them was even the Holy Roman Emperor. King Louis's queen was actually a Habsburg. Like I said, they were good at marrying for power. And so, when news of his death reached Europe, Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, and Louis's brother-in-law rushed to Hungary and made himself the king. A Habsburg trying to claim Hungary didn't make the nobles there happy, and this split the kingdom in two. Royal Hungary in the north was controlled by Ferdinand and the Habsburgs, while the rest of the former kingdom was ruled indirectly by the Ottoman Empire through a puppet king. This arrangement was not what Suleiman wanted. He had hoped for total control of Hungary to use it as a staging ground to invade Europe, and so he attacks the home of the Habsburgs, Vienna. His siege of the city fails. Twice. And before he knows it, Suleiman finds himself locked in a decades-long personal war with the Habsburgs. The wars with the Habsburgs are on again, off again, but time after time, Suleiman is blocked from reaching Europe. He's now approaching his 60th birthday, and the Habsburgs are still preventing him from manifesting his destiny. He is running out of time, and so in 1552, after what he feels is a betrayal of a peace agreement, he sends two armies across the border into Royal Hungary to try again to inch his way towards Europe. After decades of constant war, the Ottoman army is a well-oiled fighting machine. In the blink of an eye, 25 Hungarian fortresses were taken by force. The Sultan's two armies are simply unstoppable, and they begin their march to their next target, a fortress on a hill that defended gold and silver mines that were essential to the Habsburgs' activity in Hungary. In early September of 1552, Captain István Dobó stands on the walls of Eger and watches as the day he had feared begins to materialize before his eyes. Dobó knew that it was only a matter of time before Suleiman arrived at his fortress and spent weeks begging Ferdinand to send reinforcements. He received no response. Dobó is left with a small force of professional soldiers and is forced to recruit peasants who had fled into his fortress walls for security. Just over 2,000 men is all he will have to try to defend this castle from 40,000 Ottoman troops. No matter, he now will only count on help from God. Dobó instructs those willing to fight that they will not surrender and instead defend Eger or die trying. Messengers from the Ottoman camp bring Dobó terms for a peaceful surrender. In response, the captain hangs a black coffin between two spears on the ramparts of the fort. The message is loud and clear, and the Ottoman siege of Eger begins on September 17th. Cannons rip into the fortress walls, and the Turks advance on the castle for 12 straight days. The peasant women who sought refuge in Eger with their families watch as their husbands, sons, and fathers fight valiantly on the fortress walls to protect them. They turn and look into the eyes of their children and begin to imagine the horrible things that would come for them if these walls fell. This nightmare cannot become a reality, and so the women, both young and old, decide to join the fight. They boil hot water and roofing tar and scramble up the walls to pour them on Ottoman soldiers below. Others take up the weapons of fallen soldiers and join their husbands in battle. For the remainder of the siege, these families of peasants would fight shoulder to shoulder to defend the fort. But as hard as the defenders try, the Turks are relentless and manage to take one of Eger's towers on September 29th. As the Ottoman soldiers pour into the breach, Dobó orders his men to point their cannons at the lost turret and collapse it onto the invaders. Though morale had remained high throughout the defense, this breach downed the spirits of some of the defenders, and a small group began to make plans to betray their captain. Dobó finds out about their scheme and has the man who led this mutiny hanged in the castle market and cuts the ears off of his supporters as punishment. Things only get worse for Dobo on October 4th as a large gunpowder reserve explodes, causing tremendous structural damage within their walls and destroying much of their dwindling supply of ammunition. Hearing the explosion, the Ottomans waste no time and launch an all-out assault. More and more Turks pour into the breach, and all hope seems lost. But a man named Gurgly Bornemisa refuses to give up. He quickly gathers up some of the remaining gunpowder, flint, sulfur, and oil and stuffs it into a giant water wheel. He lights the wheel and sends it hurtling directly towards the Turks as they approach the walls. The gunpowder ignites, and as the wheel barrels towards the attackers, it begins shooting off projectiles as it spins faster and faster, which douses the Ottoman army in flaming oil. I'm on fire!
What kind of monster could come up with this? Now I'm on fire too!
The battle continues for another week, and as bad as things seem for the defenders of Agar, things had gotten much worse for the Ottoman army outside. They did not expect this siege to take this long, and had now run out of ammunition. The two Turkish commanders had begun bickering over who was to blame for this disaster, and disease had also swept through their camp. Many of their soldiers no longer had the will to fight, and officers began resorting to pushing their men towards the walls at sword point. On October 17th, half of the battered Ottoman army leaves Agar, and the remaining army follows them the next day. An estimated 9,000 Ottoman soldiers died trying and failing to take the fortress. Against all odds, Commander Dobo and his ragtag group of 2,000 soldiers, farmers, and women had just handed the Ottoman Empire their first defeat in their war against the Habsburgs, and he becomes a national hero in Hungary for leading one of the only defensive last stands in history that actually won. Battle of Cameron. For most history fans, the American Civil War is probably the first thing that comes to mind when you think about the 1860s. But did you know that at the very same time, just south, the French were conducting a full-scale invasion of Mexico, and it was actually in this conflict that one of the greatest last stands in history took place. It's 1861, and the Emperor of France, Napoleon III, feels he has just come up with the perfect plan to grow his empire. At the time, the Civil War was raging in the United States, and with the Americans busy killing each other, Napoleon thought this might be the perfect time to test that pesky Monroe Doctrine, a treaty that prohibited European states from messing around in the Americas. And just as luck would have it, Mexico had just given him the perfect opportunity to do just that. See, the Mexicans had just come out of their own civil war that nearly bankrupted them. They owed a ton of money to Europe, and being broke, the new government had stopped paying their loans. This was no bueno to Europe, and so Spain, the UK, and France each sent troops to Mexico in December of 1861 to get their money back. The UK and Spain quickly reach an agreement with the Mexicans and head back to Europe. But France, on the other hand, begins to send more troops to Mexico, and it quickly becomes clear to everyone that Napoleon's goals aren't just collecting overdue debts. This was an old-school imperial invasion. Tensions continue to escalate as more and more French troops land in Mexico, and in 1862, 6,500 of Napoleon's imperial army begin a march towards Mexico City. The Mexicans scramble soldiers and militia to defend their capital, and skirmishes break out en route. The Mexicans fight valiantly, but the French push them back at every battle and seem unstoppable. But on May 5, 1862, the Mexicans again try to stop the French army as they enter the town of Puebla, and though they're outnumbered, they manage to beat them back for the first time. This victory proved the Mexicans could go toe-to-toe with one of the greatest armies in Europe, and in fact is still celebrated unknowingly by Americans across the country to this day as Cinco de Mayo. But anyways, when news of the defeat at the Battle of Puebla reaches Napoleon, he's equally humiliated and enraged. He orders 20,000 more troops to be deployed to stamp out the Mexican resistance, and by 1863, the French have nearly 30,000 soldiers in Mexico, and amongst the reinforcements were a small band of soldiers from the French Foreign Legion. Made up exclusively of refugees, criminals, and ex-mercenaries whom Napoleon wanted to get out of Paris, the Foreign Legion was a real kill two birds with one stone idea. Deploying these burdens on society to fight battles far away from France would not only clean up his streets, but also give his generals some cannon fodder to send into the most dangerous places. Unexpectedly, the legionnaires had proven themselves as fierce fighters in the Algerian campaign. But despite their bravery, they were still considered to be low-class soldiers. Useful, but ultimately expendable. Little did anyone know that this reputation would soon be changed forever as the French began their second attempt to avenge their most embarrassing defeat in Mexico. On March 16, 1863, the French attack Puebla a second time and lay siege to the town. Cannons rip apart buildings, and the Mexicans are forced to abandon their initial defensive positions. But what was supposed to be a quick victory earned through shock and awe drags on as the Mexicans raise barricades on every street and force the French to fight house to house. By the end of April, the French were running low on ammunition, so supply caravans were sent from Veracruz on a 60-mile journey to Puebla. In the caravan were 3 million francs in gold to pay the troops, ammunition, and additional artillery weapons. But word travels quickly, and soon native spies inform the French that the Mexican guerrillas are planning to attack the caravan. Reinforcements must be sent immediately to protect the convoy, and so 62 soldiers and 2 officers from the 3rd Company 1st Battalion of the French Foreign Legion, under the command of Captain Jean d'Anjou, are sent out in the dark of night to find the convoy and help escort it to Puebla. On April 30th, at 5:45, after having marched throughout the night, the exhausted legionnaires arrive at the planned rendezvous point. They begin to brew some coffee to try to wake up, but their short break is almost immediately interrupted as 250 Mexican cavalry appear on the horizon. D'Anjou orders his men to chuck their coffee, and they make a quick break for an abandoned hacienda, a compound with a 2-story farmhouse surrounded by 10-foot walls in the nearby town of Cameron. As they near the hacienda, 800 Mexican cavalrymen emerge ahead of them, and they quickly charge the legionnaires. D'Anjou orders his men to form a hollow square, and firing in volleys, they manage to push back the cavalry charges twice while continuing to retreat to the farmhouse. The Mexicans continue to chase them, and 16 of D'Anjou's men are captured. The remaining 49 legionnaires manage to make it inside the hacienda, but Mexican forces soon arrive and completely surround them. D'Anjou realizes they are trapped, and the chances of survival are grim. But maybe they can stall the Mexicans just long enough for the supply convoy to slip away and reach Puebla. D'Anjou watches as more and more Mexican troops gather outside the compound. He takes a deep breath and turns to his men. He holds out his hand, a wooden one that replaced the one he'd lost fighting for the Legion, and asks them to swear on it that they will all fight to the death rather than surrender. The men pledge their lives to their captain, who then opens a bottle of wine, and together they share one last drink. The Mexican commander soon sends in a negotiator, and he asks D'Anjou to surrender, stating that if they resist, they'll be needlessly slaughtered. The captain answers back that he and his men have plenty of ammunition, and instead they will continue to fight. Bewildered, the negotiator returns to his commanding officer with the news, and at 11 a.m., the Mexicans storm the compound. The legionnaires fire round after round into the hostile crowd, who are quick to return fire as they storm the hacienda. In the firefight, D'Anjou is hit and soon dies from his wound. Casualties quickly begin to pile up on both sides, but more Mexican reinforcements arrive at Cameron, bringing their numbers to over 2,000 men. The negotiator again tries to get the legionnaires to surrender, but the only response he gets is from a sergeant stationed on a roof. "Go to hell!" In response, the Mexicans breach the walls of the hacienda, and firefights break out throughout the courtyard. The legionnaires continue to fight, but by 5 p.m., only 12 of them remain standing. The Mexicans withdraw from the compound and give the French one last chance to surrender. This offer is met with complete silence. At 5:30 p.m., the Mexican forces launch a final charge, and within an hour, all that's left of D'Anjou's men are a lieutenant and 4 soldiers who find themselves trapped in a small storehouse. As the men watch Mexicans approach their position, they fire their last rounds and begin to affix their bayonets to their rifles. The lieutenant gives the command, and the last of the legionnaires erupt from the shed. On sight, the Mexicans open fire. The lieutenant and a soldier who had jumped in front of him trying to protect him are instantly gunned down. The 3 remaining men are quickly surrounded, and guns are trained on them from every direction. A Mexican officer shouts orders not to fire and begs for the legionnaires to surrender. The men look at each other and finally agree, upon the condition that they can keep their weapons and their lieutenant be given immediate medical care. The officer takes the 3 remaining legionnaires to his colonel, and the Mexican commander cannot believe his eyes. Is this all of them? Is this all of the men who are left?" These are not men, they are demons. Outnumbered 40-1, the 65 soldiers under the command of Captain Danjou had killed 300 Mexican soldiers and wounded another 500. Tales of the Battle of Cameroon spread throughout Europe, and the reputation of the French Foreign Legion changed overnight from second-rate soldiers to one of the most elite fighting forces in the world. And that's pretty much what they're still thought of today. Battle of St. Jacob an der Burs. These days, people usually don't think of the Swiss as badass warriors, but throughout most of the Middle Ages, they were widely considered the most terrifying army in Europe, and this story is one that helped cement that reputation. It's 1436, and Frederick VII, the Count of Toggenburg, has died without leaving an heir or will. Frederick was the ruler of the canton of St. Gallen, a member of the Swiss Confederacy, and unsurprisingly, dying without a clear succession plan quickly threw the region into chaos. The nearby canton of Zurich quickly claimed Frederick's lands for themselves, and just to be extra dick about it, they cut off grain supplies to other cantons in the area. By 1440, the rest of the Confederacy had had enough of Zurich's behavior and voted them out of the club, and a civil war, now called the Old Zurich War, began. The burgomaster of Zurich, a guy named Stussy, finds himself all alone against the Confederacy, and so he stoops to the most detestable thing any Swiss at the time could ever imagine. He asks the Holy Roman Empire for help. Historically, the Swiss Confederation was formed with the sole purpose of fighting for their independence against the Holy Roman Empire. A canton asking them for help was the most traitorous thing any Swiss could imagine, and as expected, Stussy was branded a traitor. But in 1443, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III, not to be confused with the Swiss Frederick VII that just died, agrees to help Zurich and sends 500 knights to help their cause. Stussy leads his combined army into battle, and immediately they're steamrolled by the now completely pissed-off Confederation forces. Stussy dies in that battle, and now the Holy Roman Emperor finds himself stuck in a war against the increasingly angry Swiss. So he calls on his friend Charles VI, the King of France, for help. Charles wants to be a bro to the HRE, so he sends his son, the Dauphin, future King Louis XI, with 30,000 mercenaries to Switzerland. These mercenaries, called the Ecochers, which literally translates to the Flayers, were battle-hardened veterans of the 100 Years' War who had now turned to terrorizing commoners in the new period of peace. These men were hungry to once again fight a worthy opponent, but they had no idea just how worthy their new opponents would turn out to be. The French arrive in Switzerland near Basel in August of 1444, and the Swiss Confederation quickly cobbles together a small force of 1,500 young pikemen as a first line of defense against the invaders. In the early morning of August 26, 1444, this small regiment, after having marched all night, finds a French vanguard in a nearby village called Pratin. As they watch these foreign soldiers casually strolling the streets, the pikemen become enraged that Zurich has stooped so low as to invite the French to fight with them. Instead of calling for reinforcements as they were instructed to do, the 1,500 Swiss pikemen are overcome with anger and charge directly at the French vanguard. A vicious battle erupts in the streets as the French, not expecting to be attacked so eagerly, are caught completely off guard. The Swiss are terrifying as they viciously cut down and impale the invaders without mercy, and soon many of the Ecochers, the scary mercenaries the Dauphin brought with him, begin to flee the battle. The pikemen quickly find another unit of French soldiers in the neighboring town of Moutons, and once again, on sight, charge directly at the vanguard and rout them as well. The Swiss now feel invincible. The French are cowards. And so, instead of following orders and reporting back like they were supposed to, they go out and hunt for the rest of the French army, whom they eventually find across the River Birs. With the sun rising high in the sky, the Dauphin and his 30,000 men stare bewildered as a small band of 1,500 Swiss soldiers wade through the river directly towards them and begin to form 3 pike squares. The mismatch is ridiculously obvious for everyone there. The French outnumber the Swiss 20-1. This is going to be a massacre. But before they can figure out what's going on, the Swiss begin charging at them in formation. The Dauphin is startled, but he quickly orders a cavalry charge. The Swiss are brave, but they can't possibly... Oh my God, we are dying! Against overwhelming odds, the Swiss maintain formation and fight off these charges again and again. Soon, the cavalry is pushed back, and the Swiss find themselves within striking distance of the main French army. The Dauphin quickly orders his crossbowmen to fire at the Swiss to finish them off. On command, thousands of bolts are sent hurtling across the battlefield directly into the advancing formations. But as they lower their weapons, the French watch in horror as the Swiss simply rip the bloody bolts from their bodies and continue to march forward undeterred. As they draw nearer, the French can see that some of these soldiers had lost their hands while fighting off the cavalry charges, yet they continued marching forward in formation using their bloody stumps to hold their weapons. Now in range, the Swiss pike squares charge at full speed, and brutal melee combat erupts as the forces clash. The battle rages on for a few hours, with soldiers on both sides falling at a rapid pace. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Swiss fight without fear. But eventually, the sheer numbers of the French army begin to collapse their formations, and they're forced to retreat to a small hospital called Saint Jacob. The French roll out cannons and open fire on the hospital. Within hours, the building is a smoking pile of rubble. The Dauphin sends Burkhard VII Munch, a Swiss noble who had sided with Zurich against the Confederation, to broker a surrender with any remaining survivors. As Munch rides his horse through the ruins of the building, he sees the broken bodies of hundreds of Swiss soldiers strewn about the floor. He raises his visor, and as he looks at the bloodied men lying all around him, he mockingly says, "I gaze upon a rose garden that my ancestors planted 100 years ago. Here, eat one of the roses." This actually happened, and he died 3 days later from that. Anyways, after the failed negotiation, the French army storms the hospital. The remaining Swiss soldiers fight to the end in a valiant but ultimately doomed last stand. Just 16 of the Swiss pikemen survived the final battle. They never surrendered, but instead were so injured that they were mistakenly piled with the other dead bodies and were later discovered alive. Though they were defeated, the small unit of crazy Swiss psychopaths managed to kill 3,000 French soldiers, and this made the Dauphin not super excited to fight the real Swiss army that was waiting for them. Not wanting no smoke, he decides to turn his army around and head back to France, where they sign a peace treaty with the Swiss Confederacy shortly after. Word of the Battle of Saint Jacob an der Burs quickly spreads throughout the land, and the Swiss earn the reputation of being the most fearless soldiers in all of Europe. So much so that they're eventually hired by the Pope to defend the Vatican, and they continue to do so until this very day.